Chapter 1 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cook. The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. The March of the Battalion compared with other historical marches. The Lieutenant Colonel commanding congratulates the battalion on their safe arrival on the shores of the Pacific Ocean, and the conclusion of their march of over 2,000 miles. History will be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. So wrote Lieutenant Colonel P. St. George Cook in Order No. 1 from Headquarters Mormon Battalion, Mission of San Diego, under date of January 30th, 1847. If Colonel Cook is accurate in his statement, and one has a right to assume that he is, since he was a graduate of the United States Military Academy of West Point, and hence versed in the history of such military incidents, then the march of this battalion is a very wonderful performance. For if history might be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry when Colonel Cook wrote his Order No. 1, then certainly no march of infantry since that time has equaled it. The only other historical marches that are comparable with the Mormon Battalion's march are Xenophon's and Doniphan's, the former in ancient, the latter in modern times. Retreat of the 10,000. Xenophon's march is commonly known as the Retreat of the 10,000, 401 B.C. The account of the retreat is given in Xenophon's Anabasis. About 14,000 Greek soldiers under a Spartan leader named Clearchus entered the service of a Persian prince, Cyrus, surnamed the Younger, brother of the then reigning king of Persia and Xerxes II. The purpose of Cyrus was to deprive his brother of the throne of Persia and reign in his stead. The expedition marched through Asia Minor to Cunaxa, near Old Babylon, where an army of 900,000 Persians engaged the army of Cyrus, which, with his Greek auxiliaries, numbered but 300,000. The smaller army was really successful in the battle, but a rash attempt on the part of Cyrus to slay his brother during the engagement, in which he himself was killed, changed the fortunes of the day. The expedition ended in failure, and hence the retreat of the Greek 10,000 up the valley of the Tigris through Armenia to Trebizond, a Greek city on the Euxine, our modern Black Sea. The march of Greek infantry, though attended with almost incredible hardships from cold, hunger, and the assaults of enemies, was not equal to the march of the Mormon Battalion for the reason that it covered but 1,500 miles, as against the 2,000 miles covered by the battalion. While the Greek infantry in their retreat numbered more men than the battalion and fought many battles, their march was, for the most part, through settled lands and along well-defined roads, while the greater part of the battalion's march was through desert lands, and 474 miles of it through trackless deserts where nothing but savages and wild beasts were found, or deserts where, for want of water, there was no living creature. Doniphan's expedition into Mexico. Doniphan's march occurred in the same year and in the same war in which the battalion served, the War with Mexico, 1846. The march is known as Doniphan's expedition into Mexico. The expedition started from Santa Fe and marched to Matamoros, near where the Rio Grande empties into the Gulf of Mexico, a distance of about 1,300 or 1,400 miles. Footnote: I am aware that the historian of Doniphan's expedition, William E. Connolly, credits the expedition with a grand circuit of 5,500 miles, 2,500 miles of which he states was by water, leaving a distance of 3,500 miles by land. But he accounts the expedition as starting from Independence, Missouri, and returning to it, whereas the expedition was organized and began its great march at Santa Fe and ended at Matamoros, where it embarked for home. End footnote. The march was via El Paso, Chihuahua, Parras, Saltillo, and Monterrey, thence to Matamoras. Here the expedition embarked for New Orleans, where the men were mustered out of service. The important battles of Bracito and Sacramento were fought en route, the former placing El Paso, and the latter the city of Chihuahua, capital of the state of the same name, in the hands of the Americans. The expedition numbered about 900 men, mostly from Missouri, and under the command of Colonel Alexander W. Doniphan of that state, and returned to Missouri via the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi. The march overland, it will be observed, was less than that of the battalions. For the most part, moreover, Doniphan's march was through a settled country, and over roads long used between Santa Fe and points in northern and central Mexico. Besides, the expedition was not exclusively made up of infantry, being mixed cavalry and infantry, and therefore would not strictly come in competition with a battalion which was entirely of infantry, with accompanying baggage wagons. Doniphan's expedition is so wonderful a performance, however, and has been so generously acclaimed, that if unmentioned in connection with the performance of the battalion and the contrast made above, it might be thought by some to rival the march of the latter. This, however, is not the case. The world's record for a march of infantry. Not even in the world's great war, now happily ended, has the Mormon Battalion's march been equaled, though in all other things that war has surpassed the previous war experiences of mankind. And since the battalion's march has not been equaled by any march of infantry in the world's great war, nor in ancient times, it is not likely now, owing to the new methods for the transportation of troops that have been developed, that the Mormon Battalion's march across more than half of the North American continent will ever be equaled. It will stand as a world's record for a march of infantry. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The Call of the Battalion. The Mormon Battalion owes its existence to the exodus of the Mormon people from the state of Illinois to the then, 1846, little-known region of the Rocky Mountain West. The leaders of that people had decided that there was little prospect for their being able to live in peace with their neighbors in Illinois, or in any of the surrounding states, owing to the existence of strong prejudices against their religion, and therefore they resolved upon seeking a new home in the West, quote, within the basin of the Great Salt Lake or Bear River Valley, believing that to be a point where a good living will require hard labor and consequently will be coveted by no other people, while it is surrounded by so unpopulous but a fertile country. End quote. Footnote. From a letter of Brigham Young to President James K. Polk, date of August 9, 1846. End of footnote. The Mormon appealed to the United States government for help. Before the exodus from Illinois began, as early as the 20th of January, 1846, the High Council at Nauvoo made public announcement of the intention of the Mormon people to move to, quote, some good valley of the Rocky Mountains, end quote, and in the event of President Polk's, quote, recommendation to build blockhouses and stockade forts on the route to Oregon becoming a law, we have encouragement, they said, of having that work to do, and under our peculiar circumstances, we can do it with less expense to the government than any other people. 6 days later, Jesse C. Little was appointed by the Mormon Church authorities president of the Eastern States Mission, and in his letter of appointment was instructed as follows, quote, if our government shall offer any facilities for emigrating to the western coast, embrace those facilities if possible. As a wise and faithful man, take every honorable advantage of the times you can. End quote. Quote, in consonance with my instructions, says Mr. Little in his report to Brigham Young, which is recorded in the latter's manuscript history, I resolved upon visiting James K. Polk, President of the United States, to lay the situation of my brethren before him, and ask him, as the representative of our country, to stretch forth the federal arm in their behalf." End quote. In pursuance of this design, Mr. Little obtained a letter of introduction from John H. Steele, governor of New Hampshire, in which state Mr. Little had been reared. The governor in his letter declared that he had known Mr. Little from childhood and believed him honest in his views and intentions, and added, quote, "Mr. Little visits Washington, if I understand him correctly, for the purpose of procuring or endeavoring to procure the freight of any provisions or naval stores which the government may be desirous of sending to Oregon, or to any portion of the Pacific. He is thus desirous of obtaining freight for the purpose of lessening the expense of chartering vessels to convey him and his followers to California, where they intend going and making a permanent settlement the present summer." End quote. From Luke Milber, also of Peterborough, New Hampshire, Mr. Little secured a letter to Honorable Mace Moulton in Washington, which, in addition to vouching for the high character of Mr. Little, based upon personal knowledge of him for 12 years, announced that he was, quote, "soliciting some aid from the general government to assist himself and brethren throughout the United States in emigrating to California." End quote. In May of the same year, at a church conference held in Philadelphia, Mr. Little made the acquaintance of the Kanes. They were an old and honorable Pennsylvania family. The father, Judge John K. Kane, had been Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, and at the time of Mr. Little's visit at his home, he was United States Judge for the District of Pennsylvania, also President of the American Philosophical Society. Dr. Elisha Kent Kane, the famous Arctic explorer and scientist, was his son, as was also Thomas L. Kane, who afterwards served with distinction as Colonel and Brigadier General in the Union Army in the war between the states. From the latter, Mr. Little received a letter of introduction to Honorable George M. Dallas, Vice President of the United States. Quote, "He visits Washington," said Kane's letter to Mr. Dallas, "with no other object than the laudable one of desiring aid of the government for his people." End quote. Little's consultation with the President. The arrival of Mr. Little at Washington on the 21st of May was most opportune for the business he had in hand. He called upon President Polk that same evening, in company with a Mr. Dame of Massachusetts and Mr. King, a representative of the same state. Sam Houston of Texas and other distinguished gentlemen were present. News of the capture of an American reconnoitering troop of dragoons under command of Captain Thornton on the east side of the Rio Grande, 16 of whom were killed, had reached Washington early in May, and enabled the President, in his message to Congress on the 11th of that month, to say that, quote, "Mexico had invaded our territory and shed the blood of our citizens on our own soil," end quote, which led Congress 2 days later to declare war and vote the funds necessary to its vigorous prosecution. By the time Mr. Little called upon the President, the news had reached Washington of the victory of the American forces under General Taylor at the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, fought on the 8th and 9th of May, respectively. News of these victories aroused the war spirit throughout the land, and hastened all the government schemes for prosecuting the war, including the plan of gathering the Army of the West at Fort Leavenworth under Colonel Stephen W. Kearny to invade New Mexico and ultimately cooperate with the Pacific Fleet, which it was designed should sweep around to Cape Horn and attack on the Pacific coast of Mexico. It was this Army of the West that the Mormon Battalion was destined to be connected. Mr. Little, a few days later, was informed by his friends in Washington that the plan for the Mormon participation in this movement to the west, discussed by the President and his cabinet, was for Mr. Little to go directly to the camps of the Mormon people in the west and have 1,000 men fitted out and plunge into California, officered by their own men, the commanding officer to be appointed by President Polk, and to send 1,000 more by way of Cape Horn, who will take cannon and everything needed in preparing defense. Those by land to receive pay from the time Little should see them, and those going by water from September 1st. At this point, Mr. Little seems to have taken up the matter personally and directly with the President, and under the date of June 1st addressed an appeal to him. In it, Mr. Little expresses confidence in the President, else he would not have left his home to ask favors of him for his people, i.e. the Mormons. He gave an account of himself and his forefathers, who fought, quote, in the battles of the Revolution, end quote, of his own character, vouched for by his letters of introduction from men of high standing, and then avers that the people he represents are as of high character as himself. Quote, "I come to you," he said, "fully believing that you will not suffer me to depart without rendering me some pecuniary assistance. Our brethren in the West are compelled to go West, and we in the Eastern country are determined to go and live, and, if necessary, to suffer and die with them. Our determinations are fixed and cannot be changed. From 12 to 15,000 have already left Nauvoo for California, and many others are making ready to go. Some have gone around Cape Horn, and I trust before this time have landed at the Bay of San Francisco. We have about 40,000 members in the British Isles, and hundreds upon the Sandwich Islands, all determined to gather to this place, and thousands will sail this fall. There are yet many thousands scattered through the states, besides the great number in and around Nauvoo, who are determined to go as soon as possible, but many of them are poor, but noble men and women, and are destitute of means to pay their passage either by sea or land. If you assist us in this crisis, said the appeal, I hereby pledge my honor, my life, my property, and all I possess as the representative of this, the Mormon people, to stand ready at your call, and that the whole body of the people will act as one man in the land to which we are going. And should our territory be invaded, we hold ourselves ready to enter the field of battle, and then, like our patriot fathers, make the battlefield our grave or gain our liberty. End quote. Mr. Little signs himself, Agent of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the Eastern States. Interviews followed with President Polk on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of June. Of the visit to the President on the 5th, Mr. Little writes in his report, quote, I visited President Polk. He informed me that we should be protected in California, and that 500 or 1,000 of our people should be taken into the service, officered by our own men. Said that I should have letters from him and from the Secretary of the Navy to the squadron. I waived the President's proposal until evening, when I wrote a letter of acceptance. End quote. There followed another and final interview with President Polk on the 8th of June. Quote, I called on the President. He was busy, but sent me word to call on the Secretary of War. I went to the War Department, but as the Secretary was busy, I did not see him. The President wished me to call at 2 p.m., which I did, and had an interview with him. He expressed his good feelings to our people, regarded us as good citizens, said that he had received our suffrages, and we should be remembered. He had instructed the Secretary of War to make out our papers, and that I could get away tomorrow. The orders to enlist Mormon volunteers. Colonel Thomas L. Kane was entrusted with the orders to Colonel, afterwards General, Stephen W. Kearney, and accompanied Mr. Little as far as St. Louis. Here they separated, Kane to go with his orders to Kearney, then to Fort Leavenworth, and Little to the camps of his people, then moving through southern Iowa. It is not known just what considerations led President Polk to cut down the number of Mormons to be sent to occupy California from 2,000 to 500, but in the orders sent to Colonel Kearney, that officer was directed not to take into the service a greater number of Mormons than 1/3 of his command, which was limited to about 1,500 men. Quote, It is known, said Kearney's order to enlist Mormon volunteers, that a large body of Mormon emigrants are en route to California for the purpose of settling in that country. you are desired to use all proper means to have a good understanding with them, to the end that the United States may have their cooperation in taking possession of and holding that country. It has been suggested here that many of these Mormons would willingly enter into the service of the United States and aid us in our expedition against California. You are hereby authorized to muster into service such as can be induced to volunteer, not, however, to a number exceeding 1/3 of your entire force. Should they enter the service, they will be paid as other volunteers, and you can allow them to designate, as far as it can be properly done, the persons to act as officers." End quote. Terms of enlistment. Under this order, Kearny issued instructions to Captain James Allen of the 1st Regular Dragoons to proceed to the camps of the Mormons and endeavor to raise from them 4 or 5 companies of volunteers to join him in his expedition to California. The character of the battalion, terms of enlistment, pledges of the government are clearly set forth in Allen's instructions. Quote, "Each company to consist of any number between 73 and 109. The officers of each company will be a captain, 1st lieutenant, and 2nd lieutenant, who will be elected by the privates, and subject to your approval. The captains then to appoint the non-commissioned officers, also subject to your approval. The companies, upon being thus organized, will be mustered by you into the service of the United States, and from that day will commence to receive the pay, rations, and other allowances given to other infantry volunteers, each according to his rank. You will, upon mustering into service the 4th Company, be considered as having the rank, pay, and emoluments of a lieutenant colonel of infantry, and are authorized to appoint an adjutant, sergeant major, and quartermaster sergeant for the battalion. The companies, after being organized, will be marched to this post, that is, Fort Leavenworth, whence the order was issued, where they will be armed and prepared for the field, after which they will, under your command, follow on my trail in the direction of Santa Fe, and where you will receive further orders from me. You will, upon organizing the companies, require provisions, wagons, horses, mules, etc. You must purchase everything that is necessary, and give the necessary drafts upon the quartermaster and commissary departments at this post, which drafts will be paid upon presentation. You will have the Mormons distinctly to understand that I wish to have them as volunteers for 12 months, that they will be marched to California, receiving pay and allowances during the above time, and at its expiration they will be discharged, and allowed to retain, as their private property, the guns and accoutrements furnished to them at this post. Each company will be allowed 4 women as laundresses, who will travel with the company, receiving rations and other allowances given to the laundresses of our army. With the foregoing conditions, which are hereby pledged to the Mormons, and which will be faithfully kept by me and other officers in behalf of the government of the United States, I cannot doubt but that you will, in a few days, be able to raise 500 young and efficient men for this expedition." End quote. Captain Allen in the Mormon camps. Captain Allen arrived at Mount Pisgah on the 26th of June, accompanied by 3 dragoons, and presented to the leading men of that place a circular to the Mormons, in harmony with his instructions. The presiding brethren at Mount Pisgah did not feel authorized to take any steps in the matter of Captain Allen's communication on the enlistment of a battalion, but gave him a letter of introduction to President Young at Council Bluffs, for which place the captain started immediately and arrived on the 30th of June. The following day he met with President Young and others in council, and presented the whole question of raising a battalion from the Mormon camps. The question arose in the minds of the Mormon leaders as to the disposition of the camps, which would be materially crippled by the withdrawal of so many young, strong, and able-bodied men. Already the question of wintering the camps and caring for so large an amount of stock possessed by them loomed large among their difficulties. About 150 miles to the west, at La Platte River, was Grand Island, 52 miles long, with an average width of 1.75 miles and well timbered, in the neighborhood of which were also immense areas of grass that might be cut for hay, and the rank growth of rushes here and there along the extensive river bottoms would enable much of the stock to winter on this range. Could government permission be obtained for a large contingent of the camp to be stationed there? This country, as well as the one the camps were then occupying, was within the Louisiana Purchase and largely divided into Indian reservations, hence could only be occupied by the whites by permission of the government. The question of government permission, therefore, in the event of the battalion being raised, was submitted to Captain Allen, and he assumed the responsibility of saying that the camps might locate on Grand Island until they could prosecute their journey. In his speech made to the camp that same day, the captain promised to write President Polk to give leave to the Mormon camps to stay on the route wherever it was necessary. At a council meeting held later in the day, on Brigham Young asking Captain Allen, if an officer enlisting men in an Indian country had not a right to say to their families, "You can stay until your husband's return," the captain replied that he was the representative of President Polk and could act till he notified the president, who might ratify his engagements or indemnify for damages. The president might give permission to travel through Indian country and stop whenever and wherever circumstances required. After the first council meeting between Captain Allen and the Mormon leaders, a public meeting was held at noon on the same day. Brigham Young introduced Captain Allen, who addressed the people. Quote, he said he was sent by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny through the benevolence of James K. Polk, President of the United States, to enlist 500 of our men, that there were hundreds of thousands of volunteers ready to enlist in the States. He read his order from Colonel Kearny and the circular which he himself had issued from Mount Pisgah and explained. End quote. Footnote. History of Brigham Young. End footnote. The statement of Captain Allen that there were hundreds of thousands of volunteers ready to enlist in the States was quite true. The declaration of war upon Mexico by the Congress, quote, authorized the President to accept the service of 50,000 volunteers and placed $10 million at his disposal. The call for volunteers was answered by the prompt tender of the service of more than 300,000 men. End quote. Quote, 4 regiments were called from Illinois, 9 answered the call, numbering 8,370. Only 4 of them, numbering 3,720 men, could be taken. End quote. Brigham Young's activities in raising the battalion. Brigham Young followed Captain Allen in an address at the aforesaid meeting. His own account of his remarks stand in his manuscript history as follows. Quote, I addressed the assembly, wished them to make a distinction between this action of the general government and our former oppressions in Missouri and Illinois. I said the question might be asked, is it prudent for us to enlist to defend our country? If we answer in the affirmative, all are ready to go. Suppose we were admitted into the Union as a state, and the government did not call on us. We would feel ourselves neglected. Let the Mormons be the first to set their feet on the soil of California. Captain Allen has assumed the responsibility of saying that we may locate on Grand Island until we can prosecute our journey. This is the first offer we have ever had from the government to benefit us. I propose that the 500 volunteers be mustered, and I would do my best to see all their families brought forward, as far as my influence extended, and feed them when I had anything to eat myself. End quote. At the close of the public meeting, another council meeting was held, with Captain Allen present, when the question of the people having a right to remain on Indian lands during the absence of the soldiers, and indeed along their whole route of travel, was further considered. Captain Allen withdrew from the council, and the 12, says Brigham Young, continued to converse on the favorable prospect before us. It was arranged that Brigham Young should go to Mount Pisgah to raise volunteers for the battalion, and that other leaders should prosecute the work of raising volunteers in the camps around Council Bluffs. There was apparently some reluctance among the people to respond to this unexpected call, and it required some considerable persuasion to dispel it. On the 11th of July, Colonel Thomas L. Kane reached the Mormon camps at Council Bluffs and gave assurance that the general government had taken the Mormons' case into consideration, inferentially with benevolent intentions. When within 11 miles of Mount Pisgah, Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball met Jesse C. Little, president of the Eastern States Mission, who reported his labors at Washington. His written report was incorporated in Brigham Young's manuscript history for that year. While at Pisgah, Brigham Young wrote the camp at Garden Grove and sent his letter by special messenger. After describing the terms of enlistment and the conditions under which the volunteers would be mustered out of service in California, etc., he said, quote, "They may stay, i.e. in California, look out the best locations for themselves and their friends, and defend the country. This is no hoax. Mr. Little, president of the New England churches, is here direct from Washington, who has been to see the president on the subject of emigrating the saints to the western coast, and confirms all that Captain Allen has stated to us. The United States want our friendship, and the president wants to do us good and secure our confidence. The outfit of this 500 men costs us nothing, and their pay will be sufficient to take their families over the mountains. There is a war between Mexico and the United States, to whom California must fall a prey, and if we are the first settlers, the old citizens cannot have a Hancock County or Missouri pretext to mob the saints. The thing is from above for our good." End quote. A letter of like spirit was sent by Brigham Young to the trustees at Nauvoo. In that letter the following passage occurs, quote, "This is the first time the government has stretched forth its arm to our assistance, and we receive their proffers with joy and thankfulness. We feel confident they, the battalion, will have little or no fighting. The pay of the 500 men will take their families to them. The Mormons will then be the old settlers and can have a chance to choose the best locations." Muster of the battalion. When Brigham Young returned from Mount Pisgah, a public meeting was held on the 13th of July, and the final work of enrollment of the battalion began. At the opening meeting, Brigham Young said, quote, "If we want the privilege of going where we can worship God according to the dictates of our conscience, we must raise the battalion. I say it is right, and who cares for sacrificing our comfort for a few years? I would rather have undertaken to raise 2,000 a year ago in 24 hours than 100 in 1 week now." End quote. Later he said to the mustering companies, quote, "You could not ask for anything more acceptable than this mission." End quote. Quote, "An American flag, the flag of the United States, brought out from the storehouse of things rescued in the Mormon exodus from Illinois, was hoisted to a tree mast, and under it the enrollment took place." End quote. Footnote. Kane's lecture, The Mormons, page 80, end footnote. The enrollment of the battalion was completed on the 16th of July, and that day Captain Allen took the organization under his command. Farewell scenes. There was no sentimental affection at their leave-taking, remarks Colonel Kane in his account of the departure of the battalion from the camps. The afternoon before their departure, a ball was given in their honor. Of this ball, Colonel Kane says, quote, "A more merry dancing rout I have never seen. Though the company went without refreshments, and their ballroom was of the most primitive kind (parentheses, under a bowery where the ground had been trodden firm and hard by frequent use), end parentheses, to the canto of debonair violins, the cheer of horns, the jingle of sleigh bells, and the jovial snoring of the tambourine, they did dance. None of your minuets or other mortuary processions of gentles in etiquette, tight shoes, and pinching gloves, but the spirited and scientific displays of our venerated and merry grandparents, who were not above following the fiddle to the Fox Chase Inn or the gardens of Gray's Ferry. French fours, Copenhagen jigs, Virginia reels, and the like, forgotten figures executed with the spirit of people too happy to be slow or bashful or constrained. Light hearts, lithe figures, and light feet had it their own way from an early hour till after the sun had dipped behind the sharp skyline of the Omaha hills." End quote. On the 20th of July, the battalion took up its march for Fort Leavenworth, where it arrived on the 1st of August, and began preparations for the Great Western March. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements, by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. Advantages and disadvantages to the Mormons arising from the enlistment of the battalion. The call for the Mormon Battalion was not an unfriendly act on the part of the United States government towards the Mormon people. A representative of the Church, as we have seen, had appealed most earnestly to the executive of the nation for aid in the western emigrations of that people, and when it was decided by the administration to accept the services of such a force of volunteers, the Mormon leaders received the decision as an answer to their appeal for aid. A sacrifice, nevertheless. But notwithstanding that government service was asked for by the representative of the Mormon people, and the granting of it was regarded by the Mormon leaders at the time as a great advantage to their people, it brought to the volunteers and to the people generally much of sacrifice. For one thing, the opportunity to avail themselves of their tendered service to the government came at an unexpected and a most inconvenient time. As explained afterwards by Colonel Kane, quote, "The young and those who could best have been spared were then away from the main body, either with pioneer companies in the van, or, their faith unannounced, seeking work and food about the Northwest settlements, to support them till the return of the season for commencing emigration. The force was therefore to be recruited from among the fathers of families, and others whose presence it was most desirable to retain." End quote. Practically 500 wagons were left without teamsters, and as many families were left without their natural protectors and providers. The families of the battalion, with the families of their friends, in whose care they must leave their loved ones, and upon whom they must depend for succor, were then scattered in a string of camps for some hundreds of miles between Nauvoo and Council Bluffs, with no certain abiding place designated, and no immediate prospect of being permanently settled. To volunteer for a war march of 2,000 miles, much of which was desert, under such circumstances was doubly hard. Moreover, the Mormon people, from their then point of view, had little to be grateful for to the government of the United States. Their appeals from what to them was the injustice of Missouri and Illinois had met with but cold reception in Washington. They did not and could not be expected to understand, much less sympathize with, the refinements employed by the national legislatures in drawing nice distinctions about the division of sovereignty between the states and the general government. They were self-conscious of wrongs inflicted upon their communities in the two states in which they had settled, Missouri and Illinois. They had appealed to the general government for a redress of these grievances without avail, and now they were asked by their leaders to go into the service of that government, which might mean the sacrifice of life, and surely meant abandonment of their families to the care of others under circumstances the most trying. To respond to the call made upon them, both as to the volunteers and the camped community whence they were mustered, was a manifestation of unselfishness not often paralleled in history. Advantages of the enlistment. Notwithstanding all the sacrifices involved, Brigham Young and those associated with him were too astute as leaders not to appreciate the advantages of having a considerable number of their people to enter the service of the United States. The charge of disloyalty to the American government had often been made against the Mormons, which not all their protests and denials could overcome. But to enter the service of the government in a time of war, involving such inconveniences as must be theirs, would be an evidence of loyalty that would stand forever, both unimpeached and unimpeachable. That such was the understanding of Brigham Young is specifically expressed by him about a month after the departure of the battalion. Quote, "Let every one distinctly understand," said he, "that the Mormon Battalion was organized from our camp to allay the prejudices of the people, prove our loyalty to the government of the United States, and for the present and temporal salvation of Israel. That this act left nearly 500 teams destitute of drivers and provisions for the winter, and nearly as many families without protection and help." End quote. The right to settle on Indian lands secured. Another advantage appealed to the leaders. It had become evident before the call was made for the battalion that while it might be possible for a specially organized pioneer company to go over the mountains that season, preparations for which were being rapidly made, the very great majority of the camps would be under the necessity of suspending a year or more in southern Iowa, principally on Indian lands. The prospects of remaining upon such lands in peace would be much enhanced if it could be pleaded that 500 of their men were in the service of the government of the United States, and subsequent events demonstrated the validity of such a plea. Also, it was the advantage sought to be secured by Brigham Young in his first conference with Captain Allen on the subject of the enlistment of the battalion. Under these arrangements of occupancy, as the Indian titles and lands in Iowa expired, the Mormon occupants acquired valuable preemption rights up and down the Missouri River from Council Bluffs for a distance of between 50 and 60 miles, stretching back on the east side of said river some 30 or 40 miles. Money value of the enlistment. Another consideration of importance was the remuneration of these soldiers. A year's pay for their clothing in advance at the rate of $3.50 per man per month would amount to $42 each, and to $21,000 for the battalion. Deciding to make their march in the clothing they had when enlisting, part of their money for clothing was sent back from Fort Leavenworth to be used for the benefit of the families of the battalion, and part of it to assist the Mormon leaders. Subsequently, agents were secretly sent to Santa Fe to bring back to the camps the pay of the soldiers that had accrued by the time they arrived there. This amounted to 3 months' pay at the following rates: Captain, $50 per month; rations, 20 cents per day; First Lieutenant, $30 per month; rations, 20 cents per day; Second Lieutenant, $25 per month; rations, 20 cents per day; First Sergeant, $16 per month; Sergeants, $13 per month; Corporals, $9 per month; Musicians, $8 per month; and Privates, $7 per month. The payment at Santa Fe was made in government checks, not very available in Santa Fe, that is, not easily negotiable, writes Colonel Cook. It has often been claimed that the battalion was paid a bounty, $42 per man, on entering the service. This was not the case. The payment for clothing 1 year in advance at the rate of $3.50 per month has been mistaken for bounty. It was only by foregoing the purchase of clothing that the battalion could send the payment for it to their families and to the Mormon leaders. This source of revenue to the camps was accounted a very great blessing at the time. In official letters to the battalion from the Mormon leaders, under date of August 16th and 21st respectively, it was said, in the first, that the battalion had been placed in circumstances which enabled them to control more means than all the rest of the Mormon people in the wilderness. In the second, Brigham Young said, quote, "We consider the money you have received as compensation for your clothing a particular manifestation of the kind providence of our Heavenly Father at this particular time, which is just the time for the purchasing of provisions and goods for the winter supply of the camp." End quote. The equipment of the battalion to be retained. In addition to this payment for clothing and the monthly pay, there was the 500 stand of arms and camp equipment which were to become the personal property of the men when discharged in California. These several considerations led John Taylor, who became the successor to Brigham Young in Mormon leadership, an address to the Mormons in England to say, quote, "The President of the United States is favorably disposed to us. He has sent out orders to have 500 of our brethren employed for 1 year in an expedition that was fitting out against California, with orders for them to be employed for 1 year, and when to be discharged in California, and to have their arms and implements of war given to them at the expiration of the term. As there is no prospect for any opposition, it amounts to the same as paying them for going to the place where they were destined to go without." Appreciation of Mormon leaders. In a letter to President Polk under date of August 9, 1846, after reminding the President of the disadvantages the Mormon camps experienced in raising the battalion, Brigham Young said, quote, "But in the midst of this, we were cheered with the presence of our friend Mr. Little of New Hampshire, who assures us of the personal friendship of the President in the act before us. And this assurance, though not doubted by us in the least, was soon made doubly sure by the testimony of Colonel Kane in Philadelphia." End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The March of the Battalion from Fort Leavenworth. At Fort Leavenworth, the battalion received its equipment of 100 tents, 1 for every 6 privates, also their arms and camp accoutrements. When drawing the checks for clothing, the paymaster expressed great surprise to find that every man was able to sign his own name to the payroll. Death of Colonel Allen. Question of successor. At Fort Leavenworth, Colonel Allen was taken ill, but on the 12th of August he ordered the battalion to start on its western march, while he would remain a few days, recuperate, and overtake them. He died on the 23rd, much lamented by the battalion, which had become warmly attached to him. Commenting on his demise, the author of the Doniphan Expedition, William E. Connolly, says, "Thus died Lieutenant Colonel Allen of the 1st U.S. Dragoons, in the midst of a career of usefulness under the favoring smiles of fortune, beloved while living, regretted after death by all who knew him, both among the volunteers and the troops." On the death of Colonel Allen, the question of succession in command was considered. It appears that this subject was mooted at the time the companies of the battalion were enlisted, and Colonel Allen repeatedly stated to us, says Brigham Young, that there would be no officer in the battalion except himself, only from among our people, that if he fell in battle or was sick or disabled by any means, the command would devolve on the ranking officer, which would be the captain of Company A and B, and so on according to the letter. The battalion appears to have had the same understanding, for at a council meeting of the officers it was agreed by them that Captain Jefferson Hunt of Company A should assume command, which decision was afterwards sustained by the unanimous vote of the men. Meantime, however, Major Horton, in command at Fort Leavenworth, sent Lieutenant A. J. Smith of the regular army to take command of the battalion. This led to a threatened complication, for an appeal to such written military authorities as were available to the officers of the battalion left them hopelessly divided in their conclusions. On the arrival of Lieutenant Smith, a council of officers was held in which the battalion officers demanded to know what reasons existed for their acceptance of him as commander rather than Captain Hunt, to which it was answered that the government property in possession of the battalion was not yet receipted for, but that Lieutenant Smith could receipt for it, and being a commissioned officer of the regular army, he would be known at Washington, and his actions and orders recognized, whereas the officers of the battalion had not yet received their commissions, and it would be doubtful if their selection of a commander would be approved. After this discussion, Captain Hunt submitted the matter to the officers, and all but 3 voted in favor of accepting Lieutenant Smith as the commander of the battalion. Complaints of the volunteers. With Lieutenant Smith had come Dr. George B. Sanderson, whom Colonel Allen at Leavenworth had appointed a surgeon in the U.S. Army to serve with the Mormon Battalion. According to the historian of the battalion, the volunteers suffered much because of the, quote, arrogance, inefficiency, and petty oppressions, end quote, of these 2 officers. This view of the officers, however, is to be accounted for by the volunteers being suddenly brought under the enforced discipline of the U.S. Army regulations. The heat of the season was excessive. The men had been already much exhausted by the strenuous labor and exposure during the journey through Iowa with their people earlier in the season, and as a result, many of them fell a prey to the malaria prevalent in that country and at this season of the year. For this, Dr. Sanderson prescribed calomel and arsenic, and as the men were adverse to taking medicine, pleading even religious scruples against the drugs, the matter gave rise to much unpleasantness between the battalion physician and the command, involving therein Lieutenant Smith, who, in the interest of what he no doubt regarded as discipline, sided with the physician. The line of march. The battalion's line of march from Fort Leavenworth after crossing the Kaw or Kansas River followed that of the 1st Missouri Dragoons, led over the route that same year by Colonel Donovan via Council Grove, thence some distance up the Arkansas River to a little beyond Fort Mann, where they crossed that river in order to take what was known as the Cimarron route, because it crossed Cimarron River and followed some distance up the south branch of the stream called Cimarron Creek. The last crossing of the Arkansas they reached on the 16th of September, and here the commanding officer insisted that most of the families, about 12 or 15 in number, which so far had accompanied the battalion, should be detached and sent under a guard of 10 men up the Arkansas to Pueblo, which nestles at the east base of the Rocky Mountain Range. There were stout protests against this division of the battalion, as it was held to be a violation of the promise that the battalion would not be divided. Also that these families should be permitted to travel with the battalion to California. Unquestionably, however, the arrangement was in the best interest both of the families and of the battalion, and accordingly the detachment was made up as proposed and marched to Pueblo under command of Captain Nelson Higgins. Arrival at Santa Fe. Condition of the command. The main body of the command continued its march southwestward to San Miguel, thence turning the point of a mountain range, marched northwest to Santa Fe, where they arrived in 2 detachments on the 9th and 12th of October, respectively. Upon the arrival of the 1st detachment, the battalion was received by a salute of 100 guns by order of Colonel Donovan, then in command both as civil and military head of the Department of New Mexico, but making ready for what was to be his great and historic march upon Chihuahua. On the arrival of the battalion at Santa Fe, it was learned that General Kearney, previous to his departure for the West, had designated Colonel P. St. George Cook to take command of the battalion and to follow on his trail with wagons to California. Speaking of the condition of the battalion on its arrival in Santa Fe, and remarking on its physical unfitness to undertake the march to California, Colonel Cook, in his Conquest of New Mexico, says, "Everything conspired to discourage the extraordinary undertaking of marching this battalion 1,100 miles for the much greater part through an unknown wilderness, without road or trail, and with a wagon train. It was enlisted too much by families. Some were too old and feeble, and some were too young. It was embarrassed by many women. It was undisciplined. It was much worn by traveling on foot and marching from Nauvoo, Illinois. Their clothing was very scant. There was no money to pay them or clothing to issue. Their mules were utterly broken down. The quartermaster department was without funds, and its credit bad, and animals were scarce. Those procured were very inferior, and were deteriorating every hour for lack of forage or grazing. So every preparation must be pushed, hurried. A small party with families had been sent from Arkansas, crossing up the river to winter at a small settlement close to the mountains called Pueblo. The battalion was now inspected, and 86 men found inefficient were ordered, under 2 officers, with nearly all the women, to go to the same point. 5 wives of officers were reluctantly allowed to accompany the march, but furnished their own transportation. By special arrangement and consent, the battalion was paid in checks, not very available in Santa Fe, that is, negotiable. With every effort, the quartermaster could only undertake to furnish rations for 60 days, and in fact, full rations of only flour, sugar, coffee, and salt. Salt pork only for 30 days, and soap for 20. To venture without pack saddles would be grossly imprudent, and so that burden was added." End quote. Invalid detachment sent to Pueblo. It was understood that men invalided and their escort, together with the women and children belonging to the battalion, would have the privilege in the spring of intercepting the main body of their people moving to the west and going with them at government expense. The above arrangement was the result of a council of the officers of the battalion with Colonel Doniphan of Missouri, then in charge of military and civil affairs at Santa Fe, and with Colonel Cook, who had been designated by General Kearney to take command of the battalion in its march to the Pacific on his own departure from Santa Fe to California. Captain James Brown of Company C and St. Elam Ludington of Company B were the 2 officers above referred to as being placed in charge of the detachment. This company arrived at Pueblo on the 17th of November and went into winter quarters near the encampment of Captain Higgins, who had preceded them to that point, and the next spring, according to the above arrangement, joined in the westward movement of their people, following so closely the pioneer company led by Brigham Young that they entered Salt Lake Valley on the 29th of July, 5 days after the arrival of the first pioneer company. To the wife of one of the members of the battalion, Mrs. Catherine Campbell Steele, wife of John Steele, Company D, was born the first white child in Utah, August 9th, 1847. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The March of the Battalion from Santa Fe to the mouth of the Gila. The battalion began its march from Santa Fe on the 19th of October. Colonel Cook in command, Lieutenant A. J. Smith, who had led the battalion to Santa Fe, became the acting commissary of subsistence, and Lieutenant George Stoneman acting quartermaster, instead of Lieutenant Samuel E. Gully, who had resigned. Both Smith and Stoneman were of the regular army. Dr. Sanderson was continued as physician-surgeon to the command. The guides to the expedition, appointed by General Kearney, were Weaver, Charbonneau, and Leroux, and Stephen C. Foster, called Doctor in all the narratives, was employed as interpreter. More invaliding. The course of the march for some time was southward down the valley of the Rio Grande. On the 10th of November, 55 more men were declared physically unable through sickness to continue the march, and accordingly were detached, and under Lieutenant W. W. Willis were ordered back to Pueblo to join the other detachments that had been sent there. After much suffering from the hardships of the journey, weak teams, scant supplies of food, illy clad, general sickness among the men, the fall of December snows in the mountain ranges north of Santa Fe, excessive cold, and several deaths occurring, this detachment finally arrived at Pueblo between the 20th and 24th of December in a most pitiable condition. But they were warmly received by members of the battalion already quartered there, numbering, now all told, about 150. Hardship of excessive toil. One cause of so many men breaking down in health was the excessive toil at the wagons through the sand stretches of the road, began early in the march from Santa Fe, while yet in the valley of the Rio del Norte, in fact, and continuing along the whole route to and through the California desert lying between the Colorado and the Coast Range mountains. Our course now lay down the Rio del Norte, the Rio Grande, says Sergeant Tyler. We found the roads extremely sandy in many places, and the men, while carrying blankets, knapsacks, cartridge boxes, each containing 33 rounds of ammunition, and muskets on their backs, and living on short rations, had to pull at long ropes to aid the teams. The deep sand alone, without any load, was enough to wear out both men and beast. Later he remarks, we had to leave the river for a time and have 20 men to each wagon with long ropes to help the teams pull the wagons over the sand hills. The commander perched himself on one of the hills, like a hawk on a fence post, sending down his orders with the sharpness of, well, to the battalion it is enough to say, Colonel Cook. One of the battalions celebrates this incident of the march in doggerel verse, of which 2 stanzas follows. Our hardships reach their rough extremes when valiant men are roped with teams hour after hour and day by day to wear our strength and lives away. We see some 20 men or more with empty stomachs and foot sore, bound to one wagon, plodding on through sand beneath a burning sun. In the trackless part of the battalion's march through the sand stretches, in addition to pulling at the wagons, companies marched at double single file in each other's footsteps to make tracks for the wagon wheels. Irrigation in New Mexico. It was while at Santa Fe and while passing down the Rio del Norte that the battalion saw for the first time irrigation in operation. Tyler describes it. Canals used for irrigation purposes were found all along the banks of the river, some of them several miles in length. They conveyed water to the farms, or as they were called in that country, ranchos. There being little or no rain during the growing season, the water was made to flow over the ground until it was sufficiently saturated, and then shut off until needed again for the same purpose. March down the Rio Grande. As the command, in its southward movement down the Rio Grande, reached the point where General Kearny left the valley for direct march westward, 228 miles south of Santa Fe, and where, too, Kearny had abandoned his wagons, the guides declared it impossible to follow the Gila route proper with the wagons, and hence a circuit to the south through Sonora, Vallejanos, and Fronteras was proposed and determined upon at a council of officers. In the first stages of this changed course, however, the road bore to the southeast, and this was not to the liking of Colonel Cook, because it would carry his command within hailing distance of General Wool, who might incorporate it in the Army of the Center, as the general's division of the invading forces against Mexico was called, to operate against Chihuahua. In that event, as the colonel himself expressed it, he would lose his trip to California. To bear to the southeast was not to the liking of the battalion, as that was not in the direction of California, but one which might lead them within the sphere of the Army of the Center, and they would find themselves discharged in old Mexico instead of California at the end of their term of enlistment. The entire command was thrown into gloom by this change in the line of march. All of our hopes and conversations and songs, says the historian of the battalion, Tyler, were centered on California. Somewhere on that broad domain we expected to join our families and friends. Below the right, the westward turn. On the morning of the 21st, says Tyler, the command resumed its journey, marching in a southern direction about 2 miles, when it was found that the road began to bear southeast instead of southwest, as stated by the guides. The colonel looked at the direction of the road, then to the southwest, then to the west, saying, "I don't want to get under General Wool and lose my trip to California." He arose in his saddle and ordered a halt. Then he said with firmness, "This is not my course. I was ordered to California." And, he added with an oath, "I will go to there or die in the attempt." Then, turning to the bugler, he said, "Blow the right." Turning westward at this point, 32 degrees 41 minutes north latitude, and but a short distance, some 30 miles, north of the present city of El Paso, the course of march was westward to San Bernardino Rancho, thence to Llanos, and so on to the San Pedro River, where the command arrived on the 9th of December. The fight with wild bulls. Here occurred the only fighting a battalion engaged in on its expedition, a battle with wild bulls. This section of the country seemed to abound with herds of wild cattle, and the males among them were much more bold and ferocious than among the buffaloes. Attracted by curiosity, these herds gathered along the line of march, alternately scampering away and approaching, and some of the bolder ones, as if in resentment of the battalion's invasion, attacked the column. Several mules were gored to death by them, both in the teams and among the pack animals, and Colonel Cook records how some of the wagons were thrown about by the mad charge of these furious beasts. The troops had been ordered to march with guns unloaded, but in the presence of such a danger the men loaded their muskets without waiting for an order to that effect, and when attacked would fire upon the charging beasts, so that the rattle of musketry was for once heard all along the line. The bulls were very tenacious for life, however, and more desperate and dangerous when wounded than before. Tyler speaks of one fight between Dr. William Spencer and a bull which was shot 5 times, twice through the lungs, twice through the heart, and once through the head, and yet would alternately rise and fall and rush upon the doctor until a 6th ball between the eyes and near the curl of the pate proved fatal. Colonel Cook confirms Tyler's narrative about the bull continuing to rush after being twice shot through the heart, and adds, "I have seen the heart." Cook also relates the feat of Corporal Frost in bringing down one of these ferocious animals. "I was very near Corporal Frost when an immense coal-black bull came charging upon us, 100 yards distant. Frost aimed his musket, a flintlock, very deliberately, and only fired when the beast was within 6 paces. It fell headlong, almost at our feet." Tyler adds, "The corporal was on foot, while, of course, the colonel and staff were mounted. On the first appearance of the bull, the colonel, with his usual firm manner of speech, ordered the corporal to load his gun, supposing, of course, that he had observed the previous order of prohibition. To this command he, the corporal, paid no attention. Thinking him either stupefied or dumbfounded, with much warmth and a vile epithet he next ordered him to run. But this mandate was as little heeded as the other. Doubtless Cook thought one man's ignorance with some stubbornness was about to receive a terrible retribution, but when he saw the monster lifeless at his feet, through the well-directed aim of the brave and fearless corporal, how changed must have been his feelings. The number of the wild bovine enemy killed in the engagement is variously reported from 20 to 60, and by one writer as high as 81. Mexican opposition at Tucson. Leaving the San Pedro, the command marched northeasterly to Tucson, a Mexican town of between 400 and 500 inhabitants. It was garrisoned at the time by a Mexican force 200 strong, according to Cook, commanded by Captain Comadron, who was under order from the governor of Sonora, Don Manuel Gandara, not to allow an armed force to pass through the town without resistance. The guides furnished the battalion by Colonel Kearney, however, declared it was for the command either to march through Tucson or make a detour which would mean 100 miles out of the way over a trackless wilderness and mountains. Cook determined to march through Tucson. Foster, the interpreter, went into the town in advance and was put under guard. A corporal, son of the Mexican commander, with 3 Mexican soldiers, was met by the command and questioned about Foster, and on admitting that he was under guard, the corporal and his escort were immediately placed under arrest by Cook, to be held as hostages for the safety of the interpreter. 1 Mexican, however, was released, who, with 2 of the battalion guides, carried a note demanding Foster's release. This was complied with, and about midnight Foster was brought to camp, attended by 2 officers authorized to make a special armistice. Cook proposed that the Mexican commander deliver up a few arms as a guarantee of surrender, and a token that the inhabitants of Tucson would not fight against the United States unless they were exchanged as prisoners of war. The Mexican prisoners were also released. These events occurred while the battalion was about 16 miles from Tucson. The next day, when on the march, Cook received a message from Captain Comadran declining the proposition to surrender. The battalion was ordered to load their guns with ball. Before reaching the town, however, another message was received saying that the garrison had retreated, taking 2 brass cannons and forcing most of the inhabitants to accompany them. About a dozen armed Mexicans met the American force to escort them into the town. Before passing through the gates, the commander of the battalion addressed the soldiers, saying, in effect, that the garrison and citizens had fled, leaving their property behind. But they had not come to make war upon Sonora, and there must be no interference with the private property of the citizens. Footnote: previous to this, the colonel had issued the following order: Headquarters, Mormon Battalion, Camp on the San Pedro, December 13th, 1846. Thus far on our course, we have followed the guides furnished us by the General, Kearny. These guides now point to Tucson, a garrison town, as our road, and assert that any other course is 100 miles out of the way and over a trackless wilderness of mountains, rivers, and hills. We will march, then, to Tucson. We came not to make war on Sonora, and less still to destroy an important outpost of defense against Indians. But we will take the straight road before us and overcome all resistance. But shall I remind you that the American soldier ever shows justice and kindness to the unarmed and unresisting? The property of the individuals you will hold sacred. The people of Sonora are not our enemies. By order of Lieutenant Colonel Cook. Signed, P.C. Merrill, Adjutant. End footnote. The battalion marched through Tucson and went into camp about half a mile beyond on a small stream. Before leaving the vicinity, Cook, with a party of 50, reconnoitered the country above the town towards a village and church where, it was supposed, the garrison and main body of the people had taken refuge. As the nature of the country, however, afforded excellent opportunities for ambush, if the Mexicans should choose to make resistance, the company of 50 returned. However, the movement was not without its value, since, according to Colonel Cook, and as was afterward ascertained, it caused the Mexicans who had fled to the aforesaid village to still further retreat, and the reinforcements which had come from the presidios of Fronteras, Santa Cruz, and Tubac to return to their posts. Junction with Kearny's Trail. Renewing its journey, the command, in the course of 3 days, by hard marching, reached the Gila River, and intersected the route followed by General Kearny 474 miles from the point at which they left it in the valley of the Rio Grande. The Southern Pacific Railroad traverses practically the route of the battalion between these 2 points. Colonel Cook made a map of this part of the battalion's journey, published in his book, and referring to it in connection with the Southern Pacific Railroad, he says, "A new administration in which Southern interest prevailed, with the great problem of the practicability and best location of a Pacific Railroad under investigation, had the map of this wagon route before them with its continuance to the west, and perceived that it gave exactly the solution of its unknown element, that a southern route would avoid both the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada with their snows, and would meet no obstacle in this great interval. The new Gadsden Treaty was the result. It was signed December 30th, 1853. The march down the Gila. Following more or less the windings of the Gila, the way made difficult from alternating stretches of deep sand and miry clay, the command arrived at the junction of the Gila with the Colorado on the 8th of January. An attempt at the shipment of part of the command's provisions down the river on a flatboat proved a sad failure and ended in considerable loss. The scheme was Colonel Cook's. The boat was constructed by placing 2 wagon beds end to end and lashing them to 2 dry cottonwood logs. On this improvised boat, 2,500 pounds of provision and corn were placed. At places, the river spread out over sandbars, with but 3 or 4 inches of water covering them. The boat was repeatedly lodged on these, and the precious stores of food had to be landed in several places. The most of it was never recovered, though repeated efforts were made to regain it. At the mouth of the Gila. Speaking of the Gila at its junction with the Colorado, and of the conditions obtaining in the command at that stage of the march, Colonel Cook writes, "A vast bottom. The country about the 2 rivers is a picture of desolation. Nothing like vegetation beyond the alluvium of the 2 rivers. Bleak mountains, wild-looking peaks, stony hills and plains fill the view. We are encamped in the midst of wild hemp. The mules are in mesquite thickets, with a little bunch grass a half-mile off. The mules are weak, and their flailing or flagging today in 10 miles is very unpromising for the 100-mile stretch, dry and barren, before them. There is no grass, and only scanty cottonwood boughs for them tonight. But I sent out 40 men to gather the fruit, called torina, a variety of the mesquite. They have gathered 12 or 15 bushels, which has been spread out to be eaten on a hard part of the sandbar. Francisco was sent across the river to fire the thickets beyond, this to clear the way for the pioneer party in the morning. He says the river is deeper than usual. It is wider than the Missouri and of the same muddy color. It is said to be 60 miles to the mouth of the river." The Colorado. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements, by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The March of the Battalion from the Colorado to the Pacific Ocean. This part of the march led through what is now marked on the maps of Southern California as the Colorado Desert, quote, "nature's exhausted region lying between the Colorado River and the eastern base of the Coast Range," end quote, some of it being below the sea level. Much of the dreary way lay through stretches of sand, and the men were compelled to aid the teams by pulling on ropes, 15 to 20 men to a wagon. No water was to be had, but by the digging of deep wells in the desert sands. These often yielded but little, and that of poor quality, of water. The suffering of both men and beasts was terrible. The march of the last 5 days, the time it took to cross the desert to the little running stream called Carrizo Creek, was the most trying of any we have made on both men and animals, writes Colonel Cook. Destitution and suffering of the men and march. "We here found the heaviest sand, hottest days, and coldest nights," says Tyler, "with no water and but little food. At this time," he continues, "the men were nearly barefooted. Some used, instead of shoes, rawhide wrapped around their feet, while others improvised the novel style of boots by stripping the skin from the leg of an ox. To do this, a ring was cut around the hide above and below the gambrel joint, and then the skin taken off without cutting it lengthwise. After this, the lower end was sewed up with sinews and
When it was ready for the wearer, the natural crook of the hide adapting somewhat to the shape of the foot, others wrapped cast-off clothing around their feet to shield them from the burning sand during the day and the cold at night. Before we arrived at the Carrizo, many of the men were so nearly used up from thirst, hunger, and fatigue that they were unable to speak until they reached the water, or had it brought to them. Those who were strongest reported when they arrived that they had passed many lying exhausted by the wayside. Colonel Cook refers to these conditions in his conquest of New Mexico. A great many of my men were wholly without shoes, and used every expedient, such as rawhide moccasins and sandals, and even wrapping their feet in pieces of woolen and cotton cloth. Of the march on the 16th of January, the colonel remarked, "Near 11 a.m. I reached, with the foremost wagon, the first water of the Carrizo. A clear running stream gladdened the eyes after the anxious dependence on muddy wells for 5 or 6 days. I found the march, that is, of the day, to be 19 miles, thus without water for nearly 3 days for the working animals, and camping 2 nights in succession without water, the battalion made in 48 hours 4 marches of 18, 8, 11, and 19 miles, suffering from frost and from summer heat." Of the march of the 17th, he says, "The men arrived here, Carrizo Creek Camp, completely worn down, staggered as they marched, as they did yesterday, the 18th. Some of the men did not find strength to reach the camp before daylight this morning. I went through the companies this morning. They were eating their last 4 ounces of flour. Of sugar and coffee there had been none for weeks. I have remaining only 5 public wagons. There are 3 private property." Yet, as showing the spirit of these battalion men in such plight, he writes of the evening in camp of that same day. "The men who this morning were prostrate, worn out, hungry, heartless, have recovered their spirits tonight and are singing and playing the fiddle." From Carrizo Creek to San Phillips. The march from Carrizo Creek was to San Phillips, an Indian village on a small stream of the same name. It was on approaching San Phillips that the rugged heart of the coast mountains was encountered, which seemed to defy aught save the wild goat, according to Colonel Cook's description, over which, with crowbar and pick and axe in hand, he continues, the battalion worked its way. Here also the chasm of living rock, more narrow than their wagons, was encountered, through which they hewed a passage for the wagons, the colonel himself taking a hand in the hewing. "I came to the canyon," said the colonel, "and found it much worse than I had been led to expect, that is, by the report of the guides. There were many rocks to surmount, but the worst was the narrow pass. Setting the example myself, there was much work done on it before the wagons came. The rock was hewn with axes to increase the opening. I thought it wide enough, and, going on, found a hill to be ascended. To avoid a still narrower pass, a great rock had to be broken before it could be crossed. But when a trial was made at the first pass, it was found too narrow by a foot of solid rock. More work was done and several trials made. The sun was now only an hour high, and it was about 7 miles to the first water. I had a wagon taken to pieces and carried through. Meanwhile we still hewed and hammered at the mountainside, but the best road tools had been lost. The next wagon body was lifted through, and then the running gear, by lifting one side. Then I rode on again and saw a wagon up a very steep hill and down again to the canyon. The work on the pass was perseveringly continued, and the last 2 wagons were pulled through by the mules, with loads undisturbed. The confused information respecting the state of hostilities, the likelihood of meeting retreating bands of Californians en route for the Mexican state of Sonora, led the colonel to renew his march on the 19th in a more strictly military order than he had hitherto followed, and the battalion, while waiting for the wagons to come up, was exercised on a prairie in military tactics. The battalion was under orders to march to San Diego and there join General Kearny.
But communication with that officer was now cut off, writes Colonel Cook. By the best information, the enemy were concentrated at Los Angeles. The general was marching on it from the south, and Lieutenant Colonel Fremont approaching from the north, so that a direct march on Los Angeles from the east was evidently the proper course, especially so as Captain Montgomery from San Diego had written January 15th that it was generally believed that parties of Californians, headed by leaders who had broken their paroles, would endeavor to effect a retreat to Sonora rather than submit to our arms. It was determined to take the direct road to Los Angeles, and the guides were sent to Warner's to collect mules, etc. At Warner's Ranchero. Warner's ranch was reached on the 21st, the battalion being again drilled en route. It was found necessary to rest at Warner's on the 22nd. This is a beautiful valley, shut in by mountains or high hills on every side, writes Colonel Cook. The name Agua Caliente comes from a bold stream issuing from rock fissures at the temperature of 170 degrees. It now sends up little clouds of steam for half a mile below. The valley, a mile long, is elliptical, and its green, smooth surface really oval. At its center stands a wonderful evergreen oak, its boughs reaching a circle 5 feet above the ground and 90 feet in diameter. The hot stream runs round one side, a cold one round the other. The Indians of cold nights select spots below the spring of agreeable temperature to sleep, lying in the stream with sod bank for a pillow. The march directed to San Diego. On the 23rd of January, a march of 18 miles was made over the hills from Warner's Ranchero. It rained several hours in the afternoon and again at night, then continued for 24 hours. The battalion had fallen upon the rainy season. All tents were blown down in the night, writes Captain Cook, speaking of the night of the 23rd. The ill-clad battalion, he continues, were drenched and suffered much. A 12-mile march over the hills from Warner's on the 25th of January brought the battalion into the Temecula Valley. There an official dispatch brought to Colonel Cook the announcement that General Kearny had returned to San Diego, and that the battalion was expected there as originally ordered. Accordingly, the next morning, the march was directed southward toward the San Diego mission. The San Luis Valley and river was crossed on the 26th, an encampment made near a ranchero. In sight of the Pacific. About noon the next day, the deserted Catholic mission of San Luis Rey was passed. 1 mile below the mission, writes Tyler, we ascended a bluff, when the long, looked-for great Pacific Ocean appeared plain to our view, only about 3 miles distant. The joy, the cheer that filled our souls, none but worn-out pilgrims nearing a haven of rest can imagine. Prior to leaving Nauvoo, we had talked about and sung of the great Pacific Sea, and we were now upon its very borders, and its beauty far exceeded our most sanguine expectations. Of this event, Colonel Cook says, the road wound through smooth green valleys and over very lofty hills equally smooth and green. From the top of one of these hills was caught the first and magnificent view of the great ocean, and by rare chance perhaps, it was so calm that it shone as a mirror. Further describing what must have been to the desert and mountain-worn battalion a wonderful scene, the colonel adds, the charming and startling effect, under our circumstances, of this first view of the ocean could not be expressed. But in an old diary, once sunk and lost in a river, I find what follows. I caught my first sight of the ocean, as smooth as a mirror, and reflecting the full blaze of the declining sun. From these sparkling green hilltops, it seemed that the lower world had turned to impalpable, dazzling light, while by contrast the clear sky looked dim. We rode on into the valley, which was near, but out of view of the sea. Its smooth sod was in sunlight and shade. A gentle brook wound through it. The joyous lark,
the gay blackbird, the musical bluebird, even the household wren, warbled together the evening song. It seemed a sweet domestic scene which must have touched the hearts of my rude far wanderers. But coming to us so suddenly, there was a marvelous accompaniment, the fitful roar of tide and surf upon a rock-bound shore, while now and then some great troller burst upon the rocks with a booming thunder. It was not a discord. From this point the march was down the coast, for the most part in sight of the ocean, in clear, bright sunlight. The battalion no longer suffered from the monotonous hardships of the deserts and cold temperature of the snow-capped mountains. January there seemed as pleasant as May in the northern states. San Diego Mission. On the 29th of January, the battalion passed into the Soledad Valley, thence by crossroads over high hills miry from recent rains, into a firm, regular road to the Mission of San Diego, encampment being made on the flat about a mile below the old mission buildings, and about 4 or 5 miles from the seaport of San Diego. In the evening, Colonel Cook rode down to San Diego and reported the arrival of his command on the Pacific. The march of the Mormon Battalion was completed. Colonel Cook's bulletin on the battalion's march. On the 30th of January, the following bulletin was written by the lieutenant colonel commanding, though not read to the battalion until the 4th of February. It tells in studied military brevity the achievements and faithfulness of the battalion, its service to the country, and is an imperishable monument in the literature of the nation. Bulletin, Headquarters, Mormon Battalion, Mission of San Diego, January 30th, 1847. Orders Number 1. The Lieutenant Colonel commanding congratulates the battalion on their safe arrival on the shores of the Pacific Ocean and the conclusion of their march of over 2,000 miles. History may be searched in vain for an equal march of infantry. Half of it has been through a wilderness where nothing but savages and wild beasts are found, or deserts where, for want of water, there is no living creature. There, with almost hopeless labor, we have dug deep wells, which the future traveler will enjoy. Without a guide who had traversed them, we have ventured into trackless tablelands where water was not found for several marches. With crowbar and pick and axe in hand, we worked our way over mountains, which seemed to defy aught save the wild goat, and hewed a pass through a chasm of living rock more narrow than our wagons. To bring these first wagons to the Pacific, we have preserved the strength of our mules by herding them over large tracts, which you have laboriously guarded without loss. The garrison of 4 presidios of Sonora, concentrated within the walls of Tucson, gave us no pause. We drove them out with their artillery, but our intercourse with the citizens was unmarked by a single act of injustice. Thus, marching half naked and half fed, and living upon wild animals, we have discovered and made a road of great value to our country. Arrived at the first settlements of California, after a single day's rest, you cheerfully turned off from the route to this point of promised repose, to enter upon a campaign and meet, as we supposed, the approach of an enemy, and this too, without even salt to season your sole substance of fresh meat. Lieutenants A. J. Smith and George Stoneman of the 1st Dragoons have shared and given invaluable aid in all these labors. Thus, volunteers, you have exhibited some high and essential qualities of veterans, but much remains undone. Soon you will turn your attention to the drill, to the system and order, to forms also, which are all necessary to the soldier. By order, signed, Lieutenant Colonel P. St. George Cook. Signed, P.C. Merrill, Adjutant. Footnote: Cook's Conquest, page 197. Subsequently, viz. on the 9th of May, on the occasion of General Kearny visiting the battalion at Los Angeles, he is reported to have said that history will be searched in vain for an infantry march equal to that of the battalions, and added, "Bonaparte crossed the Alps, but these men have crossed a continent." End footnote. Small wonder, though the reading of this bulletin to the battalion was unaccountably delayed for 4 days, that the Mormon volunteers received this official announcement of their achievements with hearty cheers. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The Battalion in California. Subsequent movements of the battalion were as follows. At San Luis Rey Mission. On the evening of their second day at San Diego Mission, an order was issued for the battalion to return to San Luis Rey Mission to garrison that station. This mission was somewhat midway between Los Angeles and San Diego, and it was doubtless thought that the battalion, by being stationed there, could keep that important position out of the enemy's hands should Mexican hostilities again be resumed, as at the time seemed probable. And they would also be available there for quicker movement either to Los Angeles or to San Diego, should danger threaten at either point. Accordingly, on February 1st, the return march was begun and ended about noon on the 3rd. Clean-up and drill. Here orders were given for a general clean-up of arms and clothes, such as they had, shaving, cutting hair, and the like. Some had not shaved since the march began, and would have preferred not to do so until they returned to their people, says the battalion's historian, but the order was imperative. It prescribed that no beard be allowed to grow below the tip of the ear, hence the mustache only could be saved. The hair also must be clipped even with the tip of the ear, hence the long and tangled locks and shocks of hair of a year's growth had to be sacrificed. By the 6th of February, the men had finished cleaning up and repairing their quarters, which, in some respects, even then, were not the most pleasant, writes Tyler, as we were overrun with fleas as well as with the more filthy vermin, and no person, however clean he aimed to be, could escape from them. On the 8th of February, according to Tyler, Colonel Cook and Lieutenant Stoneman commenced a squad drill with officers which continued and extended to companies and thence to the battalion, and lasted all together for 20 days, when the battalion was supposed to have learned the drill, and all the officers was considered capable of teaching it. Company B at San Diego. On the 15th of February, Company B was ordered to be detached from the battalion and directed to march to the port of San Diego to perform garrison duty at that place, though the order, apparently, for the removal of the company was not given until the 15th of March. Los Angeles garrisoned by Companies A, C, D, E. On the 18th of the same month, 9 privates of Company A, 8 from C, 5 from D, and 8 from E, were designated as a detachment under command of Lieutenant Oman and Sergeant Brown to garrison the mission of San Luis Rey, while the remainder of the companies A, C, D, and E were designated to go to Los Angeles for garrison duty. These companies began their march on the 19th and arrived at Los Angeles on the 23rd. The chief activities here were maintaining, by successive details from the command, an outpost at Cajon Pass, 50 miles northeast of Los Angeles, as a protection against hostile bands of Indians, and the erection of a fort on an eminence commanding the city of Los Angeles. The San Luis Rey detachment remained at that post until the 6th of April, when, under orders, the station was abandoned and the detachment marched to Los Angeles. The companies thus grouped so remained until near the expiration of the term of their enlistment. The Conquest of California. The conquest of California was easily achieved. Fremont in the north, with a company of but 60 Americans, with whom he had been sent to explore portions of New Mexico and California, was opposed in the vicinity of Monterey by a force under General Castro in June 1846.
With the aid of American settlers in the vicinity of San Francisco, Fremont defeated the Mexicans in 2 engagements, and on the 5th of July, the American Californians declared themselves independent and placed Fremont at the head of their affairs. On the 7th of the same month, Commodore Sloat, then in command of the U.S. squadron in the Pacific, bombarded and captured Monterey. On the 9th, Commodore Montgomery took possession of San Francisco. Commodore Stockton arrived on the 15th of July and, in cooperation with Colonel Fremont, took possession of the city of Los Angeles on the 17th of August. There was, however, a subsequent uprising in the South, an attempt of the Mexicans to regain possession of the country. The attempt, however, proved abortive, and was chiefly noteworthy as occurring at such a time as to allow General Kearny's troop of 100 soldiers, who had marched from Santa Fe, to participate in some of the last engagements, December 16, 1846, and January 8, 1847. These ended in the conquest and brought to pass the pacification of California. The Kearny-Fremont controversy. A question of authority arose between Colonel Fremont and General Kearny. The former had acted in the self-appointed capacity of military commandant of California. General Kearny refused to recognize him in that capacity, since in addition to being Fremont's superior military officer, Kearny also had been instructed himself to establish civil government in California. Fremont refused to obey the orders of his superior and was ordered home to be tried for his disobedience. He was deprived of his commission, but in consideration of previous service, it was offered to him again, but refused, and Fremont, quote, went again to the wilderness and engaged in exploration, end quote. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The Record of the Battalion in California. The battalion had opened a wagon road to the Pacific, but had arrived too late to participate actively in the conquest of California. It was useful, however, in the performance of garrison duty at San Diego, San Luis Rey, and Los Angeles, and in connection with the New York Volunteers recently arrived under command of Colonel Jonathan D. Stevenson via Cape Horn to San Francisco Bay, also in connection with the constantly increasing naval forces along the coast. They assisted in making secure the conquest achieved. While performing garrison duty, many members of the battalion at San Diego obtained permission to accept employment of the inhabitants of the town, such as making adobes, digging wells, building houses, and making bricks. The first bricks in San Diego, and for matter of that in California, were made and burned by members of the Mormon Battalion. They made an enviable reputation for industry and frugality. Efforts to re-enlist the battalion. As the expiration of the term of the battalion's enlistment drew near, strong efforts were made for their re-enlistment by General Kearny before departing for the East in May. On the 4th of May, writes Tyler, an order was read from Colonel Cook giving the battalion the privilege of being discharged on condition of being re-enlisted for 3 years as U.S. dragoons, but under the circumstances the generous proposition could not consistently be accepted. General Kearny addressed the battalion on the 10th of May. He sympathized with us in the unsettled condition of our people, says Tyler, but thought, as their final destination was not definitely settled, in this, of course, the general's information was defective, we had better re-enlist for another year, by which time the war would doubtless be ended and our family settled in some permanent location. In conclusion, he said that he would take pleasure in representing our patriotism to the President and in the halls of Congress, and give us the justice our praiseworthy conduct has merited. It was on this occasion, according to Tyler, that General Kearny, in praising the battalion, said, Bonaparte crossed the Alps, but these men have crossed a continent. Colonel Jonathan D. Stevenson of the New York Volunteers, who succeeded Colonel Cook in command of the battalion by being given command of the Southern District of California, Colonel Cook, having been detailed to accompany Kearny on his return to the East, made an effort to induce the battalion to re-enlist. Stevenson's effort was prompted by Governor Richard B. Mason's instructions. Stevenson represented, among the advantages of the battalion's re-enlistment, the privilege of choosing their own officers, and the fact that the Mormon commander would be the third in rank among the officers of California and might become first. The battalion's officers quite generally favored re-enlistment, but not so the men, who, under the leadership of Father Pettigrew, William Hyde, and Sergeant Tyler, were in favor of returning to their families and the body of their people. The result of the effort at re-enlistment was that a company of 81 officers and men re-enlisted for 6 months and performed a garrison service at San Diego. Homeward bound. The rest of the battalion, on being mustered out of service in July, began their march for the Great Basin of the Rocky Mountains, going via Sutter's Fort at the juncture of the American and Sacramento rivers, northeastward from San Francisco about 75 miles, and now the site of Sacramento, capital of the state. About one-half of these returning volunteers arrived in Salt Lake Valley on the 1st of October. The reason for not more than one-half of this number reaching the Salt Lake Valley that fall, they numbered about 240 when leaving Los Angeles, arose from the following circumstances. Arriving at Sutter's Fort and finding opportunity for employment at good wages, a number desired to take advantage of that opportunity, and accordingly, with the consent and approval of their associates, a few remained. On the 6th of September, when the returning volunteers were leaving the basin of Lake Tahoe, they met Samuel Brannan, leader of the Brooklyn colony of Mormons to San Francisco Bay via Cape Horn in 1846. Brannan was returning to California from his visit to Brigham Young, whom he had met at the Green River crossing and accompanied to Salt Lake Valley. He gave the battalion members a doleful account of the semi-desert region where the Mormon people were settling, and predicted their final removal to California. He urged all, except those known to have families in Salt Lake Valley, to return to California and work until spring. This without avail. The next day, however, the volunteers met Captain James Brown, ranking officer of the Pueblo detachment of the battalion, and a small party, and wrote for California. He brought with him letters from many of the families of the battalion. Also an epistle from the Mormon leaders advising those who had no means of subsistence to remain in California and labor during the winter, and make their way to Salt Lake Valley in the spring, bringing their earnings with them. About one-half of the volunteers accepted this suggestion and returned to Sutter's Fort, where they found employment. The rest of the company continued their journey to Salt Lake Valley, where they arrived at the time already stated. The discharge and payment of the Pueblo detachment. Captain Brown took with him to California the muster rolls of the Pueblo detachment of the battalion, and also had a power of attorney from all its members to draw their pay. The Pueblo detachment had drawn their pay per Captain Brown up to May at Santa Fe, at which time he received orders to resume the march to California via Fort Laramie. The detachment arrived in Salt Lake Valley on the 29th of July, where they were disbanded, since the term of their enlistment had expired on the 16th of that month. On the presentation of the claims for the 3 months' pay still due to this detachment to Governor Mason of California, they were allowed. "Paymaster Rich," says the governor, "paid to Captain Brown the money due to the Pueblo detachment up to that date, according to the rank they bore upon the muster rolls, upon which the battalion had been mustered out of the service." The purchase of Ogden site with battalion money. Sometime early in 1848, the Goodyear claim to a tract of land at the mouth of Weber Canyon, said to be 20 miles square, was purchased by Captain James Brown out of the battalion money collected by him, and by the advice of the council, meaning the High Council at Salt Lake City. The sum paid was $1,950 cash down.
In this statement, I follow the journal history of Brigham Young, which under date of March 6, 1848, contains a letter from Father John Smith, president of the Salt Lake High Council, giving the Mormon leader, absent at the time in winter quarters, the above information. The Goodyear Tract is specifically described as commencing at the mouth of Weber Canyon, thence following the Wasatch Mountains north to the Hot Springs, thence westward to the shores of the Salt Lake, along the shores southward to a point opposite Weber Canyon, thence eastward to the point of beginning. Goodyear was supposed to have held this tract of land on which Ogden City now stands by virtue of a Mexican grant. This, however, it was subsequently discovered, was not the case. Goodyear's title amounted to no more than a squatter's claim, as there were evidently no Mexican grants of land in the eastern and northern parts of the territories ceded to the United States by Mexico that rested upon any clearly valid evidence of title from Mexico. And the government of the United States in subsequent years refused to recognize the so-called Mexican grant of Goodyear's, and held that title inhered in the government of the United States alone, and that by virtue of the secession of the territory to the United States. Such title, however, as Goodyear claimed, was purchased, as above related, and by battalion money. And while the title of Goodyear was not valid, the purchase quit-claimed his title, such as it was, and gave a sense of security to the colonists who first settled upon one of the most desirable tracts of land in the Salt Lake Valley. The battalion's contribution of seeds to Utah colonies. These returning members of the battalion brought to Utah various kinds of garden and fruit seeds, as well as grain from California, all which were found to be very useful in the new colonies, where both variety and quantity of seeds were limited. Lieutenant James Pace introduced the clubhead wheat, which proved to be hardy and of thrifty growth in Utah soil. Daniel Tyler brought the California pea, which in the early years grew so prolific as the field pea of Utah. The detached members of the battalion who wintered at Pueblo brought with them to Salt Lake Valley the variety of wheat known as Taos, which, mixed with the clubhead, became for many years the staple seed wheat sown in Utah fields. The battalion's part in the discovery of gold in California. As already stated, a number of the Mormon Battalion members found employment at Sutter's Fort, with Mr. John Sutter himself, in fact, who was a rather enterprising Swiss, one who had houses and land and flocks and herds, mills and machinery. He counted his skilled artisans by the score, says the account I am following, and his savage retainers by the hundred. He was moreover a man of progress. Among his pressing needs and the needs of the country at large was a sawmill. The flour mills he then had in course of construction needed timbers, and there would be large profit in shipping lumber to San Francisco. Accordingly, his foreman, a Mr. James W. Marshall, a native of New Jersey, and then about 33 years of age, and a carpenter, took in hand the task of building a sawmill. After considerable exploration, the requisite combination of water power, timber, and the possibility of easy access to the fort was found in the Coloma Valley, on the South Fork of the American River, and about 45 miles due east of the fort. In the latter part of August, or the 1st of September, Mr. Marshall, with a party of about a dozen white men, 9 of whom were discharged members of the Mormon Battalion, and about as many Indians, went to Coloma Valley and began the construction of the proposed mill. A brush dam was built in the river, and a mill race constructed along a dry channel to economize labor. The largest stones were thrown out of this, and during the night the water would be turned in to carry off the dirt and sand. On the 24th of January, while sauntering along the trail race inspecting the work, Mr. Marshall noticed yellow particles mingled with the excavated earth, which had been washed by late rains. Sending an Indian to his cabin for a tin plate,
Marshall washed out some of the soil and obtained a small quantity of yellow metal. During the evening, he remarked to his associates of the camp that he believed he had found gold, which was received with some doubts, the expressions being, "I reckon not," and "no such luck." But Henry W. Bigler, one of the battalion members, made the following entry in his journal that day. Monday, 24 January. This day, some kind of metal was found in the tail race that looks like gold. January 30th. Clear, and has been all the last week. Our metal has been tried and proves to be gold. It is thought to be rich. We have picked up more than $100 worth this week. The date of the discovery of gold. Thus it is the journal of a member of the Mormon Battalion which determines the date of the event which startled the world. Usually the 19th of January is given as the date, but in his History of California, Bancroft discusses the subject as follows. The 19th of January is the date usually given, but I am satisfied that it is incorrect. There are but two authorities to choose between. Marshall, the discoverer, and one Henry W. Bigler, a Mormon engaged upon the work at the time. Besides confusion of mind in other respects, Marshall admits that he does not know the date. On or about the 19th of January, he says, Hutchins Magazine, 200. I am not quite certain to a day, but it was between the 18th and the 20th. Whereupon the 19th has been generally accepted. Bigler, on the other hand, was a cool, clear-headed, methodical man. Moreover, he kept a journal, in which he entered occurrences on the spot, and it is from this journal I get my date. If further evidence be wanting, we have it. Marshall states that 4 days after the discovery, he proceeded to New Helvetia, identical as to the location with Sutter's Fort, with specimens. Now, by reference to another journal, New Helvetia Diary, we find that Marshall arrived at the fort on the evening of the 28th. If we reckon the day of discovery as one of 4 days, allow Marshall 1 night on the way, which Parsons gives him, and count the 28th 1 day, we have the 24th as the date of discovery, trebly proved. The tide of Western civilization started. The discovery of gold is the historical event that turned the eyes of the civilized world to California. Within a year, it started that mighty wave of Western emigration from all parts of the United States, many parts of Europe, and even from Asia. It was to be a subject of the President's message to Congress before the close of the year. Within 2 years, it would make California one of the sovereign states of the American Union, with a population of nearly 100,000. In 7 years, it would result in adding nearly $500 million to the world's store of gold. And then, as the gold from soil and sand was exhausted, and costly operations upon gold-bearing quartz ledges and delving into the earth were required to secure the precious metal, many men who had come to the mines turned their attention to agriculture and to horticulture, and found in the grain fields, vineyards, and the orchards of the Pacific slope even a greater source of wealth than the gold mines. For a time, an effort was made to keep the discovery of gold quiet, but gradually it became known, and the secret of the Sierras was revealed to the world, with the result already noted. San Francisco, however, was indifferent for some time. The final conversion of that town to the discovery of gold did not take place until Samuel Brannan, the leader of the Brooklyn colony of Mormons to California, came down from Sutter's Fort, where he had a store, to San Francisco, in company with a number of others who had with them specimens of collected gold in both dust and nuggets. Brannan, holding in one hand a bottle of yellow dust, and with the other, swinging his hat, rushed down the street shouting, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River!" This in May, and soon afterwards San Francisco was deserted for the gold fields. The Mormon Battalion diggings on the American River. The spare time of the Mormons at Sutter's sawmill was devoted to washing out gold in the mill race and from the deposits of the sandbars along the river. Henry Bigler, on the 21st of February, wrote to members of the battalion at Sutter's Fort, telling them of the discovery of gold, but cautioned them to impart the information only to those who could be relied upon to keep the secret. They entrusted it to 3 other members of the battalion. 6 days later, 3 of the number, Sidney Willis, Levi Fifield, and Wilford Hudson, came up to the sawmill and frankly told Mr. Sutter they had come to search for gold, and he gave them permission to mine in the tail of the mill race. The next day they began work, and were fairly successful. Hudson picked out 1 piece of gold worth $6. After a few days, however, these men felt under obligations to return to the fort, as they had given it out that they were merely going to the sawmill on a visit and a few days' shooting. Returning, Willis and Hudson followed down the stream for the purpose of prospecting. Fifield, accompanied by Bigler, followed the wagon road. About halfway between the sawmill and the fort, Hudson and Willis, on a bar opposite a little island in the river, found a small quantity of gold, not more than $50 in value, and while the smallness of the find filled the 2 prospectors with disgust, the other battalion members at the fort insisted upon being taken to the point where the gold had been found, that together they might examine the place. It was with difficulty they prevailed upon them to do so, remarks Bancroft, but finally Willis and Hudson consented, and the so lately slighted spot, continues the historian of California, presently became famous as the rich Mormon Diggins, the island, Mormon Island, taking its name from these battalion boys who had first found gold there. But notwithstanding this new discovery by these members of the battalion, and notwithstanding their development of the discovery of Mr. Marshall, and the huge excitement which followed, and the fact that whenever they could get released a day from their duty to their employer, they could usually obtain in gold several times over their day's wages, history has to record that they were true to their engagement to Mr. Sutter. They had promised Sutter, says Bancroft, to stand by him and finish the sawmill. This they did, starting and running on the 11th of March. Henry Bigler was still there. On the 7th of April, Bigler, Stevens, and Brown presented themselves at the fort to settle accounts with Sutter. The Call of Duty. The call of duty was also pressing upon these battalion men from another direction. The instructions from the Mormon leaders to the members of the battalion, as we have seen, was that they should remain in California during the winter, but to make their way to the Salt Lake Valley in the spring, bringing their earnings with them. Hence, when settling with Sutter on the 7th of April, the preliminaries were arranged for this prospective journey to the Great Basin of the Rocky Mountains. The 1st of June was fixed upon as the time of their departure. Notice was given to Sutter accordingly, so that by that time he could replace the Mormon workmen in his employ by others. Horses, cattle, and the seeds they intended taking with them were to be bought of him. Also 2 brass cannons to be a defense against possible Indian attacks en route, and for defensive use against a like foe in the Salt Lake Valley. At first, a company of 8 went into the mountains to explore a route, but found the snow too deep for passage at that time. The constantly growing gold excitement also, in consequence of its general unsettling of things, delayed their departure a month beyond the time fixed upon for starting. Meantime, many of the battalion members availed themselves of the opportunity to search for gold. Bigler and 2 others of the battalion followed up the American River from the fort about 15 miles, finding gold as they went. Arriving at Mormon Island, they came upon the 7 members of the battalion mining there, who, that day, had taken out $250. Bigler and his associates mined for 2 months about 1 mile below the sawmill, dividing with Sutter and Marshall, who furnished the tools and provisions. The landowners demanded 1/2 of the product for a time. This was finally reduced to 1/3. In the midst of this prosperous mining activity and the daily growing gold fever, the mad rush from San Francisco and other parts of California, the members of the battalion sought out a rendezvous for their gathering preparatory to the journey across the mountains. The place of rendezvous was called by them Pleasant Valley, near the present site of Placerville, a short distance up the South Fork of the American River, and not far from the place where gold was first discovered on that stream. Parties came in one after another until the 3rd of July, when about 45 men and one woman, the wife of one of the party, had assembled, bringing with them wagons, horses, cattle, and other effects. On the 3rd, a start was made. As the wagons rolled up along the divide between the American River and the Consumnes on the National 4th, writes H. H. Bancroft, their cannon thundered independence before the high Sierras. Thus, as further remarked by the author here followed, amidst the scenes now every day becoming more and more absorbing, bringing to the front the strongest passions of man's nature, at the call of what they deemed duty, these devotees of their religion unhesitatingly laid down their wealth-winning implements, turned their back on what all the world was just then making ready with hot haste and mustered strength to grasp at and struggle for, and marched through new toils and dangers to meet their exiled brethren in the desert. The fame of having discovered gold may not be claimed for members of the Mormon Battalion. That belongs to Mr. Marshall, unquestionably, though the Mormons in camp, when it was found of white men, were in the majority, and the shovels in their industrious hands it was which threw up the gold-laden soil. And they were the first to extend the discovery, and theirs the honors to first chronicle the date and fact of the event that was to mean so much to the Pacific coast of America and to the world. But while the honor of making the mere discovery of gold may not be claimed for them, that which is infinitely better may be claimed for them, the honor of writing into the annals of California and of the world's history this fine example of fidelity to duty detailed above, and which is not overmatched in any of the records written by men. Ascent of the Sierras from the western side. It was a difficult task to cut a wagon road from the west side through the lofty Sierras that faced them, a task of infinite toil and in the presence of great danger from the lurking savages. 3 pioneers who had insisted upon going in advance to blaze the route for the main company had been murdered by the Indians. These pioneers were named Daniel Browett, Ezra H. Allen, and Henderson Cox. The main camp came upon their mutilated bodies at a spring which, because of this event, still bears the name Tragedy Spring. What numbers of these savages the main company would encounter, what their mood would be, murderous or friendly, of course could not be conjectured. It was of the dangers they must risk. By almost incredible toil and patience, however, this company of Mormon Battalion men conquered the ascent of the Sierras from the western side, hewing a roadway for their 17 wagons through stony heights, and in like manner down steep declivities and narrow gorges until the eastern sloping deserts beyond were reached, and, finally, the valley of the Great Salt Lake, about the 1st of October, 1848, to them, for the time, the place to which duty had called them. Wagon trail from Los Angeles to Salt Lake. The company that re-enlisted at Los Angeles for 6 months beyond the battalion's original term of enlistment served 8 months, and then were mustered out of the service. Some of these, on being disbanded, went by way of the coast to the mines, or engaged in other industries in California for a time. But most of them finally made their way to Salt Lake Valley in the course of 1 or 2 years, although a few remained permanently in California. A squad of 25 from this company, however, on being mustered out of the service, organized at once for the journey to Salt Lake Valley, taking with them 1 wagon and a band of 135 mules. They went by way of what was called the Southern Route, hitherto, however, traveled only by packers, and the wagon of this battalion company was the first to make the journey over the pack trail.
This company reached Salt Lake Valley on the 5th of June, 1848. Evidence of appreciation of the battalion's services. The best evidence that the service of the Mormon Battalion was honorable and appreciated by both the people of California and the U.S. government exists in the fact of the efforts that were made on the part of both the people and the government to prolong their service, some of which efforts have already been noted in these pages. As the time approached for the company that had re-enlisted to be mustered out of service, known as the Company of Mormon Volunteers, the people of San Diego drafted a petition, begging the governor to use his influence to keep the company in the service. The petition was signed by every citizen in the town, and Governor Mason tried hard to induce the company to remain in the service another year. Failing in that, then to stay 6 months longer. All to no purpose, however. The volunteers were determined to join their friends and families in Salt Lake Valley and made the journey as stated above. Efforts to raise a second Mormon battalion. When the battalion proper was mustered out of service in July 1847, efforts were set on foot at that time to raise a second Mormon battalion, of which Captain Jefferson Hunt was to be given the command, with the office of lieutenant colonel, the office held by its first commander Allen and later by Colonel Cook. It is learned from a report made by Governor Mason that the War Department, and hence the National Administration, also sought the enlistment of this second battalion. In his report to the Adjutant General of September 18, 1847, Governor Mason says, "Of the service of this battalion, of their patience, subordination, and general good conduct, you have already heard. And I take great pleasure in adding that, as a body of men, they have religiously respected the rights and feelings of these conquered people, and not a syllable of complaint has reached my ears of a single insult offered or outrage done by a Mormon volunteer. So high an opinion did I entertain of the battalion, and of their special fitness for the duties now performed by the garrisons in this country, that I made strenuous efforts to engage their services for another year." The month following, after Governor Mason had met Captain Brown of the Pueblo detachment and received his report and paid off that division of the command, also after Captain Hunt, who had been for some time acting as Indian agent at San Luis Rey, was well on his way to Salt Lake Valley to raise the proposed 2nd Battalion of Mormon Volunteers, Governor Mason wrote to Washington, "Captain Brown, after making his report and receiving the pay of the Pueblo detachment, started immediately to Fort Hull. He reported that he had met Captain Hunt, late of the Mormon Battalion, who was on his way to meet the emigrants and bring into the country this winter, if possible, a battalion, according to the terms offered in my letter to him of the 16th of August, a copy of which you will find among the military correspondence of the department. In my letter I offered Captain Hunt the command of the battalion with the rank of lieutenant colonel with an adjutant. But I find, by the orders lately received, that a battalion of 4 companies is only entitled to a major and acting adjutant. I will notify Captain Hunt of this change at as early a moment as I can communicate with him. I am pleased to find by the dispatches that in this matter I have anticipated the wish of the department." When, however, the subject of raising a 2nd battalion was presented to Brigham Young, both through Colonel Jonathan D. Stevenson of the New York Regiment of Volunteers, prompted by Governor Mason, also through Captain Hunt in person, the proposition was declined. Regarding the first enlistment from the standpoint alone of the sacrifices it involved, President Young saw no occasion to make like sacrifices a second time, and no effort was made in Utah to raise a 2nd Mormon battalion. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B.H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The Battalion in the Perspective of 73 Years. The story of the Mormon Battalion is now before the reader,
The perspective of 73 years corrects many of the misapprehensions that once obtained respecting the purpose of its being called and its mission. And as this perspective corrects the misconceptions of the past, so also does it enable us to recognize the real importance and the value of the incident and the greatness of the achievements of this battalion of the United States troops, for such they were, and the matter of their coming from the westward migrating camps of the Mormon people should not be allowed to obscure that fact. The battalion as Utah pioneers. Also, it should be always held in mind that the members of the battalion were among the pioneers and founders of the state of Utah. For though the main body of the battalion went to California, its members were never for a day separated in thought or purpose from the main body of their people, whom they had assisted in their westward moving pilgrimage by means sent to them from their pay, from both Fort Leavenworth and from Santa Fe, the seeds and the tents and arms equipment they brought with them when returning from their historic march, and the newly mined gold for currency, all of which was so helpful in founding the Commonwealth to be, to say nothing of the advantage their service in the Army of the West had been to their people in securing the effective element in the plea for their right to occupy Indian lands along the Missouri River in Iowa and Nebraska. Besides 150 of their number with their tents, arms, teams, wagons, and other equipment, quartered at Pueblo during the winter of 1846-47, followed so closely upon the heels of the first company of pioneers led by Brigham Young that they arrived in the Salt Lake Valley only 5 days after the advent of the first pioneer company. Achievements of the battalion. 4 great movements made possible the development of the West, the great Intermountain region, and the Pacific slope. These were 1. The opening of the highways, 2. The conquest of northern Mexico, 3. The discovery of gold in California, and 4. The adoption of irrigation farming by an Anglo-Saxon people. In all of these movements, the battalion was an important factor. The part that the battalion took in opening the highways to the Pacific has already been detailed in the story of their march, and fully recognized in the military order already quoted in these pages, and which is now on file as a government document in Washington. Territory added to the United States by the conquest of Mexico. In all, says a reliable authority, more than 590,000 square miles were added to the territory of the United States as a result of the Mexican War. This included the west half of what is now the state of New Mexico, the west half of Colorado, all of Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and California. For this territory, which equaled in extent 2/3 of the territory of the original 13 states of the Union, the government paid Mexico $15 million. Including Texas, says the authority here followed, the additions of territory were more than 965,000 square miles. Or, as another historian states it, territory equal in area to Germany, France, and Spain added together. The Gadsden Purchase and the battalion route. Commenting on the battalion's march and the map he made of it, Colonel Cook says, "A new administration," this was the Pierce administration, 1853-1857, in which the Southern interests prevailed, with the great problem of the practicability and best location of a Pacific Railroad under investigation, had the map of this wagon route before them, with its continuance to the west, and perceived that it gave exactly the solution of its unknown element, that a southern route would both avoid the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevadas with their snows, and would meet no obstacle in this great interval. The new Gadsden Treaty was the result. It was signed December 30th, 1853. This purchase added to the territory of the United States 45,535 square miles, for which was paid $10 million. The purchase was made by James Gadsden of South Carolina, minister to Mexico, hence the name Gadsden Purchase.
In addition to the wagon road opened westward through southern New Mexico, Arizona, and California, we have seen that it was a detachment of 25 discharged members of the battalion which brought the first wagon through from the coast via Cajon Pass to Salt Lake Valley, following what is now the general course of the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, and which became known in the early Utah-California times as the Southern California route to the coast. Also, as we have seen, the battalion members returning from the gold fields of the American River region cut a new wagon road, much of the way, for their 17 wagons and 2 cannons from the western side of the Sierra, across the summit of that lofty range, thence down to the eastern sloping deserts of Nevada, and so to Salt Lake Valley. The conquest of northern Mexico, including, of course, California and Utah, as well as New Mexico, and (transcriber's note: text is missing in the original) lengths of their conduct, not only on the march to the Pacific Fleet of the American Navy and the Army of the West, the main division of which was under the command of General Stephen W. Kearny. The battalion's part in the conquest is detailed in the foregoing narrative, and also is acknowledged in the military order by Colonel Cook, referred to several times, and given in full in a preceding page of this book. In addition to all this, the battalion reflected great credit upon the community of Utah pioneers, of whom it never ceased to be a part, by reason of the excellence of their conduct not only on the march to the Pacific coast, but also when doing garrison duty in Southern California. The efforts to secure the re-enlistment of the battalion, and, failing that, the effort to secure the enlistment of a second Mormon battalion, were the conscious confessions of both California and federal officials, since both participated in such efforts, to the worth of these United States soldiers. Quote, "They religiously respected their rights and feelings of the conquered people of California. Not a syllable of complaint of a single insult offered or any outrage done by a Mormon volunteer," end quote, is the record of the battalion, and the re-enlisted volunteers, according to the report of them by Governor Mason. Such is the reputation of the battalion, of its officers, chosen from their ranks, and of its men, the rank and file. The part the battalion played in the discovery of gold has already been detailed. Connection with irrigation. The connection of members of the battalion with the introduction of irrigation among an Anglo-Saxon people, and most likely coming from their suggestion, is a deduction from circumstances rather than a fact sustained by direct and positive proof. When Brigham Young's company of pioneers were about to leave Green River on July 4, 1847, they were overtaken by a detachment of 13 men from the battalion who were in pursuit of men who had stolen horses from their camps some 7 days' travel eastward. These men had been with the several invalided detachments from the battalion, about 150 in all, that had wintered in Pueblo, in what is now the state of Colorado. They were incorporated into the Pioneer Company and came on with it to Salt Lake Valley, and undoubtedly members of this group would be upon the ground that 23rd day of July, when plowing was first attempted on the South Fork of City Creek, on the present site of Great Salt Lake City. The annals of that day say that the ground was so dry and hard that in the attempt to plow it, several plows were broken, whereupon, at someone's suggestion, who it was that made it, the annals do not disclose, and it is not known, a company was set at work to put in a dam in the creek and flood the land in order to plow it. This was the beginning of Anglo-Saxon irrigation. As already stated, who it was that made the fortunate suggestion that the water be turned out upon the land in order to make it possible to plow it is not known, but we have seen that 13 members of the battalion were among the pioneers, and some of them had seen irrigation in operation among the Mexicans at Santa Fe and further south in the valley of the Rio Grande. What more likely than that some of those men who had seen irrigation in progress should suggest the flooding of the land to prepare it for plowing, as they had seen it conducted over the land to convey moisture to the growing vegetation? The probability of it has moral certainty. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The subsequent distinction achieved by the battalion's commanding officers. It may be of interest, and certainly it belongs to the history of the battalion, to say that its commanding officer and the 2 lieutenants of the regular army, his staff officers, rose later to honorable distinction during the war between the states. Colonel Cook. Colonel Cook, after returning to the East with Stephen W. Kearny, continued in the military service of the United States and was active in the Kansas-Nebraska troubles of the early 50s. In 1857-8, he commanded the cavalry in the Johnston expedition to Utah, and it is of record that when that command passed through the streets of Salt Lake City en route from the mouth of Emigration Canyon to the place of its encampment west of the Jordan, the colonel rode with uncovered head through the city. Quote, out of respect to the brave men of the Mormon Battalion he had commanded in their march to the Pacific. End quote. For a time after the departure of Albert Sidney Johnston to the east, or rather to the south, for that officer espoused the cause of the Southern Confederacy against the Union, Colonel Cook for a time was in command of Johnston Army at Camp Floyd in Cedar Valley, west of Utah Lake. During the Civil War, Colonel Cook, though a Virginian, served on the side of the Union Army and rose through the grade of Brigadier General, 1861, to the rank of Brevet Major General, 1865. Lieutenant A.J. Smith. Lieutenant A.J. Smith, in the same war, rose from the grade of Commander of California Volunteers to that of Brigadier General of Volunteers, 1862, and to Major General of Volunteers, 1864. In the Battle of Nashville, he commanded the 16th Corps of General Thomas's right and received the brevet of Major General in the regular army for his services in that battle. Lieutenant George Stoneman. Lieutenant George Stoneman in 1861 was in command at Fort Brown, Texas, with the rank of captain. Later he was in command of the Union cavalry in the Peninsula Campaign. After the death of General Philip Kearny at Chantilly, Stoneman took the command of the fallen general's division and commanded the 3rd Corps at Fredericksburg. At Chancellorsville he commanded the Federal cavalry. In a raid upon Andersonville, the object of which was to liberate the Federal soldiers imprisoned there, he was captured by the Confederates. After the war, he was in command of one of the many military departments created by the government, and from 1883 to 1887 was Governor of California. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B. H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. Anecdotes. Colonel Cook, in addition to natural austerity of temperament, was a strict disciplinarian, and generally held himself aloof from the men. A few anecdotes that fortunately survived the march, and which were related by Wilford Woodruff at the celebration of Pioneers' Day in 1880, show the colonel in some of his better moods, and witness the fact that he could be somewhat broadly tolerant of the independent attitude of some members of his Mormon command. The Woodruff narratives follow. Character of Colonel Cook. Those who marched with him, Colonel Cook, can understand him much better than I can describe him. I think he possessed a better heart than his language would sometimes indicate. He was a strict disciplinarian, and, like Lord Nelson, expected every man to do his duty. But he had a peculiar streak in his composition at times that induced him to see how far the Mormon Battalion would go in obeying his commands, and that were inconsistent with reason and good judgment. As an illustration of this, for the edification or amusement of the remnant of the battalion who are present, I will refer to a few incidents, and if I do not get everything as it transpired, I will get it as nearly as I can from the reports of those
who were present. Colonel Cook and Christopher Layton. On one occasion, while the battalion was crossing a river with a ferry boat, Colonel Cook was sitting on his mule on the bank looking at them. The boat went down into such deep water that the setting poles did not touch bottom. "Try the upper side," said he. They did so, but could not touch bottom. The colonel then took off his hat and said, "Goodbye, gentlemen. When you get down to the Gulf of California, give my respects to the folks." He then rode off and left them, not waiting to see whether they would reach shore or go down the river. He soon returned and found they had got ashore. While sitting there, Christopher Layton rode up to the river on a mule to let it drink. Colonel Cook said to him, "Young man, I want you to ride across the river and carry a message from me to Captain Hunt." It being natural for the men to obey the colonel's order, he, Layton, tried to ride into the river, but he had gone but a few steps before his mule was going in all over. So Brother Layton stopped. The colonel hallooed out, "Go on, young man, go on, young man." But Brother Layton, on a moment's reflection, was satisfied that if he attempted it, both he and his mule would stand a good chance to be drowned. The colonel himself was satisfied of the same, so Brother Layton turned his mule and rode off, saying as he came out, "Colonel, I'll see you in hell before I will drown myself and mule in that river." The colonel looked at him for a moment and said to the bystanders, "What is that man's name?" "Christopher Layton, sir." "Well, he is a saucy fellow." Colonel Cook and Lot Smith. On another occasion, while the battalion was at Santa Fe, Colonel Cook ordered Lot Smith to guard a Mexican corral, and having a company of United States cavalry camped by, he told Lot if the men came to steal the poles to bayonet them. The men came and surrounded the corral, and while Lot was guarding one side, they would hitch to a pole on the other and ride off with it. When the colonel saw the poles were gone, he asked Lot why he did not obey orders and bayonet the thieves. Lot replied, "If you expect me to bayonet United States troops for taking a pole on the enemy's ground to make a fire of, you mistake your man." Lot expected to be punished, and he was placed under guard, but nothing further was done about it. The colonel, the mule, and Bigler. Colonel Cook called upon W.H. Bigler as a provost guard one day to guard his tent. The colonel had a favorite mule, which was fed some grain on a blanket. One of the freight mules came up and helped to eat the grain. The colonel drove him off several times, but he would follow him again until the colonel got vexed and said to Bigler, "Is your musket loaded?" "No, sir." "Then load it and give it to me." Brother Bigler is the last man on earth that anyone acquainted with him would have supposed would have played any tricks on the colonel. But he took out a cartridge and bit off the ball end, which he dropped on the ground. He then rammed the powder and paper down the gun, capped it, and handed it to the colonel. Several of the officers of the battalion were looking on. As the mule came back to get the grain and had arrived within a rod of him, the colonel fired the charge into its face. But the only effect it had upon the mule was to cause it to give a snort, wheel around, and kick at him, and then run off a few rods, after which it turned to come back again. This created a good deal of amusement with the lookers-on. The only remark the colonel made as he handed back the musket to Brother Bigler was, "Young man, that gun was not properly loaded." Wire, wire, damn you, sir. Colonel Cook had rather more sternness than familiarity in him. When he gave an order, if he was not fully understood by the soldiers, they did not like to question him. On one occasion he wanted some wire to fix up his tent. He ordered one of the soldiers to go to a certain man and get some wire, but he did not speak plainly, and the soldier did not understand what he said. Nevertheless, the soldier started to go on the errand, but began to think that he could not tell what to ask for. So he went back to the colonel and asked him what he had told him to get. The colonel said, "Wire, wire, wire, damn you, sir." The soldier went to the man and asked for some wire for Colonel Cook. but the man had not got any wire. "What did you ask for?" inquired the colonel when the man returned. "I asked for wire, 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 damn you, sir." That will do, young man. You may go to your tent." Colonel Cook's respect for the battalion. These instances show a little of the kind of temperament Colonel Cook possessed, but he had a good, generous heart. He entertained great respect for the Mormon Battalion, and he always spoke kindly of them before the government and all men. When he went through Salt Lake City with Colonel A.S. Johnston in 1858, he uncovered his head in honor of the Mormon Battalion. That 500 brave men he had led 2,000 miles over sandy deserts and through rocky canyons, in the midst of thirst, hunger, and fatigue, in the service of their country. May God bless Colonel Cook, and may he bless the battalion and their posterity after them. End of chapter 11. Addenda of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B.H. Roberts. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Wayne Cook. The Battalion's Monument. The march and achievements of the Mormon Battalion are worthy of celebration in an enduring form that shall perpetuate the memory of them to future generations. This has been recognized for many years, and the idea of such a memorial has been kept alive in the community by a women's organization known as the Daughters of the Mormon Battalion, composed of direct female descendants of the men of that organization. Of late years, the interest has taken on a wider scope, until now the whole state of Utah and the surrounding Intermountain states have become awakened to the duty of properly commemorating by a monument this unique event in the history of our country and of the Utah pioneers. The State of Utah Mormon Battalion Monument Commission. This awakened sense of duty led to the creation of the State of Utah Mormon Battalion Monument Commission by the 12th Legislature of the State of Utah. It is instructed to proceed with the erection of a monument upon the Capitol grounds to commemorate the important contribution made to the early settlements of the State of Utah and the western portion of the United States by the Mormon Battalion. The appointment of this commission and the mandate given to it were the sequence of an act of the previous legislature, the 11th, which had appointed a former commission of 7 citizens to investigate the subject of such a monument, choose a site for it upon the Capitol grounds, select the design, and report to the legislature next succeeding. Accordingly, a site was selected. A competition held in which the architects and the sculptors of Utah and also of the United States were invited to participate, and in which prominent sculptors and architects from the whole country did participate, submitting plans and models of their designs, from which a committee composed of Utah's prominent artists and architects selected 3 as winning first, second, and third places respectively, and 2 which were awarded cash prizes as per terms of the competition. Acting upon the judgment of this committee, the design accorded first place was recommended by the Monument Committee to the 12th Legislature, and an appropriation of $100,000 asked for, not to be available, however, before 1920, and only when a like amount of money should be raised from other sources. The report of the first committee resulted, as before stated, in the appointment of the present commission, the making of the aforesaid appropriation of $2,000 additional for contingent expenses, and authorizing procedure with the work. Mr. G.P. Griswold, the successful sculptor in the competition, associated with Messrs. James R.M. Morrison and Mr. Walker, architects, Chicago, Illinois, were notified of the action of the legislature. The following spring, Mr. Morrison of the firm of the sculptor and associated architects, being in Salt Lake City and meeting with some members of the commission, volunteered the making of a larger model of the design submitted by Mr. Griswold. This model has been inspected by a special committee appointed by the Utah State Commission
and finally adopted by the full Commission as the accepted design and model of the monument to be erected on the Capitol grounds. Description of the monument. The written report of Mr. Samuel C. Park, formerly mayor of Salt Lake City, made on behalf of the committee that went to Chicago to inspect the model to the Utah State Mormon Battalion Commission, may well be taken for a description of the Mormon Battalion monument that is proposed to erect on the Capitol grounds. Quote, "To the chairman of members of the Mormon Battalion Monument Commission, as a member of your subcommittee delegated to go to Chicago to inspect the model of the proposed Mormon Battalion monument, I have the honor to report. The base is in triangular form with concave sides and rounded corners. A bronze figure of a battalion man is mounted upon the front corner. Flanking him on two sides of the triangle are cut in high relief, on the left, the scene of the enlistment of the battalion under the flag of the United States of America. On the right, a scene of the march where the men are assisting in pulling the wagons of their train up and over a precipitous ascent, while still others are ahead, widening a cut to permit the passage of the wagons between the outjutting rocks. The background is a representation of mountains of the character through which the battalion and its train passed on the journey to the Pacific. Just below the peak in the center and in front of it is chiseled a beautiful head and upper part of a woman, symbolizing the spirit of the West. She personifies the impulsive power and motive force that sustained these battalion men and led them as a vanguard of civilization across the trackless plains and through the difficult defiles and passes of the mountains. The idea of the sculptor in the spirit of the West is a magnificent conception and should dominate the whole monument. The bronze figure of the battalion man is dignified, strong, and reverential. He excellently typifies that band of pioneer soldiers which broke away through the rugged mountains and over trackless wastes. Hovering over and above him, the beautiful female figure with an air of solicitous care guards him in his reverie. His face stands out in full relief. The hair and diaphanous drapery waft back, mingling with the clouds, while the figure fades into dim outline in the massive peaks and mountains, seeming to pervade the air and the soil with her very soul. The spirit of the West is but one of the many attributes of deity symbolizing that infinite love and care which the deity has for all his children, and it represents the hope, courage, and determination which moved and impelled the battalion man, his comrades, and all the others who have followed in their footsteps in the settlement and development of the Great West. It is the spirit back of the breaking of the soil by the farmer, back of the institution of our schools, back of our mines, back of our government and of our very hearthsides. It permeates the air, the soil, and the hearts of men. It tempers the character of all who come within the influence of the boundless plains and majestic peaks. It has led men to make a garden of a desert and a treasure house of the mountain. It has justified and approved every sacrifice to make this part of the world a better place in which to live. It is constant, never-ending, infinite. It is pleasant to contemplate these thoughts as expressed in the model at this time when the world is all but overcome with the idea of individualism, and while new governments, shifting as the sands, conceived in greed, envy, and malice, daily are born, struggle, and die. Our proposed monument represents and commemorates such ideal and cooperation, steadfastness, and progress as should be a lesson and an inspiration to this and to succeeding generations. The back of the monument has been most happily designed. It is the third side of the triangle and remains to be described. The central idea is the dimly suggested figure of an Indian woman of the southwestern type, whose head shows in relief against the background of peaks, and whose body and outstretched arms, draped in the customary blanket, are faintly suggested in the crags and rocks. In fact, the head is the only part of the figure that is chiseled clear in outline, the balance of the figure being only dimly suggested. Evanishment of race. Just as the spirit of the West in the front dominates and pervades, so this figure has the air of receding and disappearance, the evanishment of a former race. The figure is heroic in size and beautifully conceived. On either side, really on the lower folds of the blanket or on the rocks whereon the blanket is suggested, are two more scenes incidental to the journey and labors of the battalion. On the right half is a scene at Sutter's Mill, where some of the battalion members, in digging the tail race for the mill, turned up the first gold-bearing gravel that led to the great gold rush to California in '49, and contributed so many millions to the wealth of the country. On the left half is shown a battalion man digging a ditch and leading the water from a creek to overflow the land so that the pioneers could break the ground that had shattered their plow points and broken their plows. This was the introduction of irrigation into Utah. The back of the monument, in its conception and treatment, by its stateliness and suggested grandeur and what the artists call atmosphere, made a distinct impression upon the committee, and no changes or modifications were thought of nor suggested. It seemed a very happy solution of a difficult problem. From the irrigating stream and the tail race of the mill, it is designed to have small streams of flowing water forming a pool in the shape of a half-moon at the rear, and so arranged as to pass this water through to the other side to form two pools or lagoons on the front side of the monument. Immediately surrounding the monument, the architects have laid out a pavement in red brick tile with a border of an Indian design. This dark tile will save the glare and dazzling reflection of the bright sun of our clear atmosphere upon a white granite monument. There are also graceful and symmetrical walks, a granite coping, and seats suitably located and arranged to give everyone ample opportunity for a casual or studied view of the monument and its parts. Beyond these walks and seats immediately around the monument, the pools, lagoon, and walks are designed to join in and harmonize with the rest of the Capitol grounds. Nothing like this monument has ever been designed or built before. It is original and unique. Few states can boast the achievements such as are commemorated in this design. More than 72 years have elapsed since the battalion made its memorable march, and the most of its members have passed to the great beyond. So this monument should be built at once if we are to proceed according to first-hand evidence and information, and not according to more or less fanciful and legendary tales concerning them and their difficult journey. It is sufficiently credible and glorifying to tell their history as it was, and without adornment. The most important events are to be shown in bronze and stone upon this monument. Its execution will certainly tax the sculptor to his utmost, but I believe it is in thoroughly capable hands, and when built will be one of the really great monuments of the United States. Therefore, let us adhere to the proposed model with steadfast purpose to build it not only as an added attraction to the many we have for the tourist and visitor, but more especially as an object of great interest for study and inspiration for our children and our children's children." End quote. Duty of the people of Utah. Such is the monument to be erected in commemoration of this great march of infantry, whose achievements are so closely and inseparably connected with winning for the United States her present inheritance in the Intermountain West and on the shores of the Pacific. Also, whose achievements and glory are so inseparably connected with the founding of the state of Utah, as the work of part of her pioneer state builders. It is the duty of the people of Utah, to whom appeal is now made, to raise the $100,000 necessary to make the state's appropriation of a like amount available to build a monument. To fail in such a duty
would be to disgrace the state. No other state in the Union has such a unique incident to celebrate as this battalion incident in our Utah pioneer history. It is both heroic and dramatic, and in the results achieved is one of the largest events contributed by any state to the history of our country. Utah owes it to the state and to the nation to build this monument. The memory of this greatest march of infantry in the world and the heroism of those who made it shall not perish from among men. It is the purpose of the Utah State Mormon Battalion Monument Commission to raise this fund by the 30th day of January 1920, Battalion Day, being the 73rd anniversary of the official ending of their march and arrival upon the shores of the Pacific. The respective counties have been organized for the campaign for the funds. Subscription lists have been opened. It is proposed to conduct a campaign of public meetings in the interest of the monument throughout Utah and the surrounding states, and give the people of the Intermountain West every opportunity to honor themselves and their posterity and their state by fittingly memorializing the march and achievements of the Mormon Battalion. End of addenda. End of The Mormon Battalion, Its History and Achievements by B.H. Roberts.